Welcome, young wizard, to a journey through the deepest mysteries of the magical world. Tonight, we venture into the shadows, where even the wisest minds find no answers, where ancient magic whispers secrets that remain unspoken, and where the greatest questions of wizarding kind echo through empty corridors of understanding. As you settle into your cozy chamber, let these unsolved enigmas carry you through realms of wonder that even Dumbledore himself could never fully comprehend. Close your eyes and drift into this chronicle of eternal mysteries, where every question leads to deeper puzzles, and every answer reveals how much more there is to learn. Deep within the bowels of the Ministry of Magic, past corridors where whispered secrets echo like prayers in forgotten cathedrals, lies a chamber that has puzzled the greatest minds in wizarding history for longer than memory can reach. The Department of Mysteries holds many wonders and terrors, but none so profound or disturbing as the ancient stone room known simply as the Death Chamber, where stands an archway that should not exist and holds secrets that perhaps were never meant to be discovered by mortal understanding. The chamber itself speaks of ages beyond reckoning, its massive stone blocks fitted together with the precision that marks truly ancient magical construction. 20 feet below the observing galleries, the sunken amphitheatre stretches in perfect circles, row upon row of stone benches, descending toward the center like the ribs of some enormous beast turned inside out. The resemblance to a courtroom is unmistakable and deeply unsettling, suggesting that this place once hosted proceedings of unimaginable gravity, where verdicts were rendered not in words, but in the irreversible crossing of thresholds that mortals were never meant to breach. But it is the archway itself that draws the eye and chills the soul with its impossible presence. Crumbling and ancient beyond measure, it stands unsupported in the chamber's heart, defying both architectural logic and magical theory. No buttresses hold it upright, no foundation anchors it to the floor, yet there it remains, as it has remained for centuries uncounted, patient as death itself, and twice as permanent. The stone from which it was carved bears the patina of ages that predate the ministry, predate the International Statute of Secrecy, perhaps predate written history itself. From this archway hangs the veil that has become legend among those few who know of its existence. Tattered and black as a moonless night, it moves with unnatural life, despite the complete stillness of the surrounding air. The fabric appears ancient beyond description, its weave suggesting craftsmanship from civilizations that may have risen and fallen before the first wizard learned to channel magic through a wand. Yet for all its apparent fragility, for all the centuries it has hung in that shadowed chamber, it remains intact, untorn by time or circumstance, as if the very concept of decay holds no dominion over its threads. Those who have witnessed the veil speak in hushed tones of its hypnotic movement, the way it seems to beckon with each gentle flutter. The motion is never quite the same twice, never following patterns that mortal minds can predict or understand. Sometimes it hangs nearly still, trembling only at the edges like a curtain touched by the faintest breeze. Other times it billows and flows as if caught in gales that exist in dimensions perpendicular to our own reality, revealing glimpses of the space beyond that the human eye cannot quite process or remember clearly afterward. But the veil's most disturbing property is not its movement but its voice, or rather, the voices that seem to emanate from whatever realm lies beyond its dark embrace. Not everyone can hear them, and those who can often wish they could not, for the whispers that drift through the chamber carry the weight of profound loss and infinite longing. Harry Potter, whose life had been marked by encounters with death from his earliest moments, found himself drawn to those voices with recognition that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the deepest chambers of his heart. Luna Lovegood, with her characteristic acceptance of mysteries that others dismissed, heard the voices with clarity that suggested her mind operated on frequencies unavailable to more conventionally grounded individuals. Her matter-of-fact acknowledgement of the whispers provided validation that they were not hallucinations or products of grief-stricken imagination, but genuine communications from whatever existence lies beyond the barrier between life and death. The voices spoke in languages that were not quite words, conveying meanings that bypassed the ear and resonated directly in the soul. Those who had lost loved ones seemed particularly susceptible to the Veil's whispered communications, as if bereavement had somehow tuned their spiritual frequencies to receive transmissions from beyond the mortal realm. The voices carried undertones of recognition, of messages meant specifically for those who mourned, of comfort and warning, and impossible promises that death might not be the absolute ending that rational minds believed it to be. The Veil's origins are lost in the mists of prehistory, buried beneath layers of ministerial bureaucracy and scholarly indifference that have accumulated like sediment over centuries of willful ignorance. No record exists of its creation, no founding document mentions its installation. No historical account explains how it came to rest in a government basement beneath the streets of London. It simply is, and has always been, as eternal and inexplicable as the forces it seems to represent. Some scholars theorize that the Veil predates the ministry itself, that the entire Department of Mysteries was built around this singular artifact because its importance transcended any single institution's understanding or authority. The amphitheater seating suggests that the chamber once hosted gatherings of significant size and importance, implying that the Veil played a central role in ancient magical society that has been forgotten or deliberately obscured by the passage of time. The most disturbing theory, whispered in the darkest corners of magical research, suggests that the Veil represents a naturally occurring phenomenon, a place where the fundamental fabric of reality has worn thin enough to allow glimpses into realms that exist parallel to our own. If true, this would mean that the Veil is not an artifact created by wizard or witch, but a wound in the universe itself, a place where the normal laws of existence break down and allow impossible things to become momentarily possible. The amphitheater setting raises questions that have never been satisfactorily answered by any scholar or ministry official. The stone benches could accommodate hundreds of observers, suggesting that whatever ceremonies or proceedings once took place in the death chamber were events of tremendous public interest or importance. The acoustics of the chamber are perfect, designed to carry sound from the central platform to every seat with crystalline clarity, implying that what happened near the Veil was meant to be witnessed and heard by assembled crowds. Archaeological analysis of the stonework suggests construction techniques that predate known magical architectural methods, implying that whoever built the chamber possessed knowledge that has been lost to subsequent generations. The precision of the acoustics, the careful calculation of sightlines, the subtle magical enhancements woven into the very stones themselves, all speak of builders who understood the Veil's properties better than any contemporary scholar, and who designed the space to facilitate whatever purposes the Veil was meant to serve. The most chilling possibility is that the chamber was designed as an execution site, that the stone amphitheater once hosted trials where the ultimate penalty was not death by conventional means but passage through the Veil into whatever existence lies beyond. The resemblance to a courtroom is too precise to be coincidental, and the elevated seating would have provided clear views of the proceedings for witnesses whose presence might have been legally or ceremonially required. Such executions would have been considered the most severe punishment possible, worse than death because they offered no possibility of return, no hope of resurrection or ghostly continuation. no familiar passage into whatever afterlife the condemned might have expected. To pass through the veil would be to step entirely outside the normal order of existence, to enter realms that perhaps were never meant to house mortal souls, to face whatever entities or forces inhabit the spaces between life and death. The religious implications of the veil's existence are staggering and largely unexplored by magical scholarship, which has traditionally focused on the practical applications of magic rather than its metaphysical foundations. If the veil represents a genuine gateway between the world of the living and whatever comes after, it challenges every assumption about death, afterlife, and the nature of consciousness itself. Does passage through the veil represent damnation or transcendence? Do souls that cross the threshold find peace or eternal struggle? Are the voices that whisper through the fabric attempts at communication or warnings to stay away? The veil's presence in a government basement raises troubling questions about ministerial authority and the ethics of studying such profound mysteries. What right does any bureaucratic institution have to control access to what might be a fundamental aspect of existence itself? How can civil servants make decisions about something that transcends human understanding? The Department of Mysteries operates under veils of secrecy that rival the physical veil itself, making it impossible for outside observers to assess whether their research serves the greater good or merely satisfies institutional curiosity about forces that should perhaps remain undisturbed. The unspeakables who study the veil work under conditions of absolute secrecy that prevent any public accountability for their methods or discoveries. They observe, they experiment, they theorize, but they share nothing of their findings with the broader magical community that might be affected by whatever truths the veil contains. This monopolization of knowledge about such fundamental questions violates every principle of scholarly inquiry and democratic governance. Yet, it continues unchallenged because few people know enough about the veil's existence to demand transparency. Sirius Black's death transformed the veil from academic mystery to personal tragedy, demonstrating with horrible finality that whatever lies beyond the archway is not merely theoretical, but devastatingly real. The casual curse that sent him stumbling backward through the tattered fabric removed from the world a man whose courage and loyalty had helped turn the tide against the darkest forces in wizarding history. Yet there was no body to bury, no familiar corpse to mourn, no physical remains that could provide closure to those who loved him. The completeness of Sirius's disappearance was more absolute than death itself. Traditional death leaves traces, memories preserved in portraits, ghosts that choose to remain connected to the mortal world, bodies that can be honored and interred according to family traditions. Passage through the veil leaves nothing, erases the victim so completely that even those who witnessed the event struggle to understand what they have seen. There was no scream, no final words, no moment of recognition or farewell. One instant Sirius was present in the world. The next he had passed beyond all possibility of return or communication. The witnesses to Sirius's passage treated his fate as immediately and irrevocably final, though none could explain why they possessed such certainty about the nature of his disappearance. Lupin, whose scholarly mind might have sought alternative explanations, accepted the loss without question or hope. Harry, who had rescued his godfather from seemingly impossible situations before, made no attempt to follow or retrieve him. The finality was absolute and instinctive, suggesting that the veil's nature is comprehensible on levels deeper than rational thought, that mortal souls recognize its terrible purpose even when conscious minds cannot articulate that understanding. The ministry's handling of the incident revealed the institutional discomfort that surrounds all aspects of the veil's existence. No investigation was conducted into the circumstances of Sirius's death. No inquiry examined whether proper security procedures had been followed. No review questioned whether the battle of the Department of Mysteries could have been prevented or its casualties minimized. The death chamber was sealed and forgotten, its secrets locked away behind ministerial classifications that ensure public ignorance of the questions that Sirius's death raised about the nature of existence itself. J.K. Rowling's confirmation that the veil represents a literal divide between life and death settles some questions while raising far more profound ones. If the barrier between existence and whatever comes after is indeed physical rather than metaphorical, then the veil stands as proof that the boundary between life and death is more permeable than most people believe, that consciousness might survive in forms that living minds cannot imagine or understand, that the fundamental assumptions about mortality that govern human behavior might be based on incomplete information about the true nature of existence. But confirmation of the veil's literal nature does nothing to explain its mechanism or purpose. How does a piece of fabric, however ancient or magical, serve as an interface between different states of being? What forces maintain its operation across centuries of existence? Why does it respond to physical contact by transporting living beings into whatever realm lies beyond? The mechanics of its function remain as mysterious as its origins, challenging every theory about how magic operates and what limits constrain its effects. The most disturbing aspect of the veil's confirmed nature is the implication that death itself might not be the final boundary that mortal minds believe it to be. If the veil can transport living beings into the realm of the dead, then the separation between life and death is less absolute than human culture assumes. This possibility opens questions about the nature of consciousness, the persistence of identity beyond bodily death, and the relationships between physical existence and whatever forms of being might survive the transition from life to whatever comes after. The voices that whisper through the veil take on new significance when understood as genuine communications from beyond the boundary of death. If the dead can speak to the living through the veil's fabric, then death does not represent the complete cessation of consciousness that materialist philosophy assumes. The implications are staggering. Do all dead retain awareness and the ability to communicate, or only some? What determines who can speak and who cannot? Do the voices represent comfort for the living, or torment for the dead, trapped between existence and whatever final destination awaits beyond even the veil's reach? The chamber remains, patient and eternal, its stone amphitheater empty of the crowds that once gathered to witness whatever ceremonies or trials unfolded beneath the archway's shadow. The veil continues its hypnotic dance, moving to rhythms that exist in dimensions beyond mortal perception, whispering secrets in languages that bypass rational thought and speak directly to the deepest chambers of the human heart, somewhere beyond its tattered fabric, in realms that living minds cannot imagine. Consciousness continues in forms that transcend every assumption about the nature of existence, identity, and the ultimate destiny of mortal souls. The death chamber stands as monument to the fundamental mystery that lies at the heart of existence itself, proof that despite all advances in magical knowledge and understanding, the greatest questions remain not merely unanswered, but perhaps unanswerable. The veil flutters in its impossible breeze, and somewhere in the whispered voices that drift through its fabric, the dead remember what it means to live, while the living struggle to understand what it truly means to die. In the darkest corners of magical jurisprudence, where mercy becomes cruelty and justice transforms into something that haunts the nightmares of even the most hardened criminals, there exists a punishment so absolute, so fundamentally horrifying, that many would argue it surpasses death itself in its terrible finality. The The Dementor's kiss represents the ultimate expression of Wizarding Law's capacity for vengeance, a sentence that strips away not merely life, but the very essence of what makes life meaningful, leaving behind only breathing shells that serve as monuments to the complete triumph of despair over hope. To understand the true horror of the Dementor's kiss, one must first comprehend what the Dementors themselves represent in the magical ecosystem of fear and despair. These creatures are not merely guards or executioners, but embodiments of hopelessness itself. Beings that exist to drain joy, peace, and positive emotion from everything they encounter. They feed on happiness as naturally as ordinary creatures consume food, leaving behind only the cold dregs of despair and the bitter taste of life's worst memories. In their presence, warmth flees not just from the air, but from the human heart, creating environments where even the strongest souls begin to question whether life has ever held genuine meaning or purpose. But the casual feeding that Dementors perform during their normal interactions with prisoners and victims pales beside the deliberate, ritualistic horror of their kiss, where their usual hunger leaves victims drained but intact, capable of recovery given time and proper care. The kiss represents total consumption, the complete extraction of everything that makes consciousness possible. It is not feeding but obliteration, not hunger satisfied, but identity devoured so thoroughly that nothing remains except the mechanical functions of a body that continues breathing without any awareness of breath, heart beating without any knowledge of why hearts beat or what purpose such rhythms might serve. The physical process of the kiss defies easy description, partly because few have witnessed it and lived to provide detailed accounts, and partly because the act itself transcends normal physical interaction to become something approaching dark miracle. The Dementor positions its hooded mouth over the victim's face, creating a connection that exists simultaneously in the physical realm and in dimensions of existence that living minds cannot fully comprehend. The extraction that follows is not violent in any conventional sense, but rather represents a form of spiritual surgery performed by creatures whose understanding of consciousness operates on principles that mortal magic has never successfully analyzed or replicated. What emerges from the victim during this terrible communion is invisible to normal sight but absolutely perceptible to the Dementor, which consumes not merely memories or emotions, but the fundamental organizing principle that transforms electrical impulses and chemical reactions into thoughts, feelings, and the indefinable sense of being that marks the difference between person and object. The soul that the Dementor draws from its victim carries with it every capacity for choice, growth, love, creativity, and moral judgment, leaving behind only the biological machinery that sustains physical existence without any of the meaning that makes such existence worthwhile. The aftermath of the kiss presents a paradox that challenges every assumption about life, death, and the nature of consciousness itself. The victim continues to exist in the most technical sense, their heart pumping blood through vessels that carry oxygen to organs that perform their designated functions with mechanical precision. They can be fed, and their digestive systems will process nourishment. They can be guided from place to place, and their legs will carry them along paths that others determine. They can be positioned before windows, and their eyes will register changes in light and shadow. But behind those eyes exists nothing that could be called awareness. No spark of recognition or understanding, or choice that would distinguish them from sophisticated automatons designed to mimic the appearance of life. Cornelius Fudge's description of the kiss as worse than death reflects not ministerial hyperbole but careful consideration of the relative horrors involved in different forms of ending. Death, however traumatic or untimely, represents completion of a natural process that every living thing must eventually experience. The dead, in the wizarding world, retain options unavailable to the kissed. They may choose to become ghosts, maintaining connection to the mortal realm through forms of consciousness that preserve memory, personality, and the capacity for interaction with the living. They may move on to whatever afterlife their beliefs and actions have prepared for them, continuing existence in forms that transcend physical limitation while retaining essential identity. But those who have received the Dementor's kiss possess none of these possibilities. They cannot die because their bodies continue functioning, yet they cannot live, because everything that gave meaning to bodily function has been consumed by creatures whose hunger knows no satisfaction and acknowledges no boundary between permissible feeding and absolute destruction. They exist in limbo between states of being, trapped in shells that provide no possibility of experience, growth, communication, or release. They are present but absent, alive but not living, conscious of nothing, including their own unconsciousness. The irreversible nature of the kiss reflects fundamental realities about the structure of consciousness that magical healing has never successfully challenged. Street, Mungo's healers, whose skills can mend bones shattered by curses, repair organs damaged by dark magic, and restore memories altered by skilled obliviators, find themselves powerless before victims of the Dementor's kiss because the damage extends beyond anything that magical medicine defines as injury or illness. There is nothing to heal because nothing is actually broken. The essential organizing principle of consciousness has not been damaged but completely removed, leaving no foundation upon which recovery could build. The kiss transforms its victims into philosophical puzzles that challenge every theory about the relationship between mind and body, soul and consciousness, identity and existence. The breathing shells that remain after Dementors have fed possess all the physical structures associated with thought and feeling: intact brains with undamaged neurons, nervous systems capable of transmitting electrical impulses, sensory organs that continue responding to external stimuli. Yet none of these biological components can generate even the simplest form of awareness because the animating force that transforms biological machinery into conscious experience has been consumed by creatures whose hunger operates on the form, levels that transcend physical appetite. The implications extend far beyond individual tragedy to challenge fundamental assumptions about justice, mercy, and the proper relationship between punishment and crime. Even the most heinous offenses, the argument goes, are committed by individuals whose capacity for evil is balanced by at least theoretical potential for redemption, growth, or genuine remorse. The Dementor's kiss eliminates all such possibilities by removing the very consciousness that could experience redemption or express remorse, creating punishment that serves no purpose except pure vengeance and societal elimination of unwanted individuals. The ministry's use of the kiss reveals disturbing truths about institutional attitudes toward justice and the proper limits of governmental power over individual existence. By employing creatures whose nature embodies despair and hopelessness as agents of official punishment, the wizarding government acknowledges that certain crimes or certain criminals warrant not merely death but obliteration, so complete that no trace of their consciousness should be permitted to survive in any form. The kiss represents ultimate expression of state power, the assertion that some individuals forfeit not merely their right to freedom or life, but their right to exist as conscious beings in any form whatsoever. Barty Crouch Jr.'s fate demonstrates how the kiss can be employed, not merely as punishment, but as political tool for eliminating inconvenient witnesses and suppressing uncomfortable truths. His testimony under Veritaserum had revealed details about Voldemort's return that contradicted official ministerial denials and threatened to expose the depth of governmental incompetence and corruption that had allowed the Dark Lord to regain power unchallenged. Rather than grapple with the implications of Crouch's revelations, Fudge chose the expedient solution of having him kissed, ensuring that the most credible witness to Voldemort's resurrection would never be able to repeat his testimony or provide additional evidence that might further embarrass ministerial leadership. The political implications of this decision extended far beyond simple witness elimination to establish precedent that the kiss could be employed whenever governmental authorities decided that certain individuals possessed knowledge too dangerous to be allowed to persist. If ministers could order the obliteration of consciousness to protect their own political positions, then the kiss represented not justice but tyranny in its most absolute form, the transformation of ultimate punishment into convenient tool for suppressing dissent and eliminating opposition. The casual manner in which Crouch's fate was determined and executed reveals institutional attitudes toward consciousness and identity that border on the sociopathic. No trial was held to determine whether his crimes warranted such extreme punishment. No appeal process allowed him to contest the decision. No review examined whether alternatives might serve justice more appropriately. The kiss was administered as matter of administrative convenience, reducing the obliteration of human consciousness to bureaucratic procedure no more significant than filing paperwork or scheduling meetings. The film's decision to omit Crouch's fate reflects understanding that visual audiences might find the casual destruction of consciousness too disturbing to process within the context of entertainment. Yet this editorial choice also eliminates opportunity for viewers to confront the true moral implications of employing such punishment. By sanitizing the story to remove its most troubling ethical dimensions, the films create more comfortable but ultimately less honest portrayal of the choices that individuals and institutions make when confronted with problems that seem to require extreme solutions. The theological implications of the Dementor's kiss challenge every religious and philosophical tradition that has grappled with questions about the nature of soul, consciousness, and individual identity. If Dementors can consume souls so completely that no trace remains to continue existence in any form, then consciousness must be more fragile and contingent than most spiritual traditions assume. The kiss suggests that individual identity exists only as long as certain organizing principles remain intact, and that these principles can be destroyed by creatures whose hunger operates according to rules that transcend normal, physical, or magical law. The absence of any known method for retrieving consumed souls raises disturbing questions about their ultimate fate. Do they continue existing within the Dementors that consumed them, conscious but powerless and trapped within creatures of absolute despair? Are they destroyed completely? Their capacity for thought, feeling, and choice eliminated so thoroughly that they never existed at all? Or do they enter some form of existence so alien to mortal understanding that no meaningful communication or recognition remains possible? The silence of magical scholarship on these questions reflects not merely ignorance, but active avoidance of implications, too terrible for comfortable contemplation. The relationship between the Dementor's kiss and other forms of consciousness, transfer, or preservation reveals troubling inconsistencies in magical theory about the nature of soul and identity. Horcruxes demonstrate that portions of soul can be separated from their original bodies and preserved in external containers, maintaining some form of consciousness and even limited ability to interact with the physical world. Ghosts prove that death need not eliminate awareness or personality, while portraits preserve enough of their subject's essential nature to engage in meaningful conversation and provide useful counsel to future generations. Yet none of these forms of consciousness preservation offer protection against the Dementor's kiss, suggesting that the creature's hunger operates on levels that transcend the magical principles governing other forms of spiritual manipulation. The kiss appears to target not merely soul fragments or preserved memories, but the fundamental organizing principle that creates consciousness from biological substrate, the mysterious force that transforms electrical impulses and chemical reactions into subjective experience and personal identity. The horror of the kiss extends beyond its immediate victims to contaminate everyone who knows of its existence, creating an atmosphere of existential terror that no amount of physical security can dispel. The knowledge that consciousness itself can be consumed by creatures that serve governmental authority transforms every interaction with ministerial officials into potential encounter with powers that threaten not merely freedom or life, but the very possibility of existing as aware, choosing individual. The kiss represents ultimate form of political control, the assertion that state power extends beyond regulation of behavior to encompass determination of who deserves to exist as conscious being. The victims who remain after Dementors have become living monuments to the complete triumph of despair over hope, physical reminders that consciousness is more fragile than mortal pride assumes, and that individual identity can be obliterated by creatures whose hunger knows no satisfaction and acknowledges no boundary between permissible feeding and absolute destruction. They breathe without awareness of breath, see without recognition of sight, exist without any understanding of existence, or any hope that understanding might someday return to animate their empty shells. In the quiet corners where such victims are kept and cared for by staff who must tend to bodies that house no consciousness, the true meaning of the Dementor's kiss becomes clear. It is not punishment but erasure, not justice but obliteration, not mercy but the complete absence of anything that mercy might address. The breathing shells serve as warnings about the ultimate consequences of challenging powers that command creatures of absolute despair, reminders that consciousness itself is a privilege that can be revoked by entities whose hunger transcends every human understanding of appetite, satisfaction, or mercy. The kiss stands as testament to the possibility that existence might be more precarious than hope assumes, that consciousness might be more contingent than courage believes, and that individual identity might be more vulnerable than wisdom dares to contemplate. In the realm of ultimate punishments, where death seems merciful and obliteration becomes policy, the Dementor's kiss represents the victory of despair over every form of hope, the triumph of absolute emptiness over every spark of meaning that makes life worth living. In the annals of dark magic, where the most terrible spells are catalogued like deadly flowers in gardens that no sane person would choose to cultivate, there exists one act so profoundly evil that its very existence challenges every assumption about the limits of magical possibility and the depths to which human consciousness can descend. The creation of Horcruxes represents not merely another forbidden art, but a fundamental violation of the natural order, a deliberate sundering of the soul that transforms the practitioner from whole person into fractured abomination, whose very existence becomes an offense against the cosmic principles that govern life, death, and the continuity of consciousness across the boundary between mortal existence and whatever lies beyond. The knowledge required to create Horcruxes has been deliberately obscured by centuries of revulsion and fear, hidden behind walls of academic silence and institutional horror that reflect the wizarding world's collective understanding that some information is too dangerous to be preserved, too corrupting to be studied, too terrible to be allowed to survive in any form that might tempt future generations into repeating the mistakes of their predecessors. J.K. Rowling herself has acknowledged the deliberate withholding of specific details, recognizing that the complete process involves elements so fundamentally repugnant that their description would serve no purpose except to provide instruction for acts that should never be contemplated, much less attempted. The foundation of Horcrux creation lies in murder, but not murder as casual act of violence or crime of passion that might be understood, if not forgiven, within the context of human weakness or temporary madness. The murder required for Horcrux creation must be deliberate, premeditated, and committed with full understanding of its purpose, as the first step in a process designed to tear the soul apart through conscious choice, rather than accidental trauma or emotional overwhelm. The killer must approach their victim with cold calculation, understanding that the life they are about to take serves not merely as means to eliminate an enemy or remove an obstacle, but as crucial component in magical ritual that will fundamentally alter their own nature in ways that can never be reversed or undone. The act of killing, when performed with such deliberate intent, creates a rupture in the murderer's soul that goes far beyond the moral damage that might result from other forms of violence or cruelty. The soul, which exists as unified whole in healthy individuals, literally tears apart under the weight of such calculated evil, creating fragments that retain some portion of the original consciousness while becoming separate entities capable of independent existence. This splitting represents not merely metaphorical damage, but actual division of the essential self into pieces that no longer function as coherent whole, transforming the murderer from integrated person into collection of spiritual fragments, held together only by the increasingly tenuous bonds of shared memory and origin. But murder alone, terrible though it is, does not complete the Horcrux creation process. The torn fragment of soul, left to its own devices, would eventually heal back into the original whole through processes that magical theory only dimly understands, but which seem to reflect the soul's natural tendency toward integration and completeness. To prevent this healing and preserve the fragment as separate entity, the would-be Horcrux creator must perform additional magical work of such complexity and horror that even theoretical discussion of its nature causes revulsion among scholars who have devoted their careers to studying the darkest aspects of magical practice. The binding of soul fragment to chosen container requires not merely advanced magical technique, but willing embrace of spiritual corruption that extends far beyond the initial act of murder. The creator must maintain their commitment to fragmentation throughout the entire process, continuously choosing division over wholeness, corruption over integrity, power over peace. Each step of the ritual reinforces the original decision to break their soul apart, creating cascading series of moral choices that drive the practitioner further from any possibility of natural healing or redemption through conventional means. Herpo the Foul, whose name has become synonymous with the darkest achievements in magical innovation, represents the first recorded successful attempt at Horcrux creation, though the circumstances of his success remain shrouded in mystery that may be deliberately maintained to prevent future attempts at replication. Ancient Greek magical practices included elements that modern wizarding society has abandoned as too dangerous or morally compromising, suggesting that Herpo's era provided cultural and intellectual framework that normalized forms of magical experimentation that contemporary practitioners would reject as fundamentally incompatible with ethical magical practice. His successful creation of the first basilisk demonstrates mastery of life manipulation that extended far beyond normal magical theory, implying access to knowledge or techniques that have been lost to subsequent generations, whether through deliberate suppression or natural evolution away from such dangerous practices. The basilisk creation and Horcrux development may be related magical achievements, both involving manipulation of life force in ways that violate natural boundaries and create entities that should not exist according to normal magical law. The basilisk, born from serpent's egg, incubated by cockerel, and nurtured through processes that corrupt normal reproductive cycles, shares with Horcruxes the quality of being artificial life that draws power from sources outside the normal flow of natural magic. Both represent attempts to achieve immortality through methods that require constant maintenance and feeding from external sources, suggesting that Herpo understood principles of magical parasitism that allowed him to create entities that could sustain themselves by draining life and energy from their environments. The knowledge that enabled Herpo's success was apparently preserved in written form, though the specific texts that contain such information have been lost, destroyed, or hidden so thoroughly that their very existence becomes matter of speculation rather than documented fact. The book known as Secrets of the Darkest Art, which provided explicit instructions for Horcrux creation, represents the most complete surviving source of such knowledge. Yet even this text has been restricted to the point where access requires special, ministerial authorization and compelling academic justification that few scholars can provide or would want to pursue. Tom Riddle's discovery of Horcrux theory during his Hogwarts years reveals the dangerous persistence of such knowledge despite centuries of attempts to suppress it completely. His conversation with Professor Slughorn, preserved in memory form and later extracted through considerable effort and emotional manipulation, provides glimpses of how theoretical discussion of Horcrux creation can be pursued without explicit instruction in practical techniques, allowing curious students to understand the general principles while remaining ignorant of specific methods required for actual implementation. Slughorn's horror at realizing the true purpose behind Tom's seemingly academic inquiry demonstrates the responsibility that magical educators bear for preventing dangerous knowledge from being transmitted to students who might use it for purposes that their teachers never intended to enable. The modification of Slughorn's memory, performed immediately after his conversation with Tom Riddle, represents desperate attempt to prevent the dissemination of information that could enable future Horcrux creation attempts. But the alteration also eliminated crucial evidence about Tom's early development into the Dark Lord Voldemort, hindering efforts to understand how promising student transformed into existential threat to wizarding civilization. The ethical complexity of such memory modification reflects broader questions about the proper balance between protecting society from dangerous knowledge and preserving information that might be necessary for understanding and preventing future threats from individuals who manage to discover such knowledge through other sources. The containers chosen for Horcrux creation reveal important information about the psychological state and motivations of their creators, serving as external reflections of internal priorities and values that shaped their approach to soul fragmentation. Tom Riddle's selection of objects associated with Hogwarts founders demonstrates obsession with the school that had provided his first experience of belonging and recognition, while his choice of items with significant historical and magical importance reflects grandiose self-image that required association with the most powerful and respected figures in wizarding history. The cup of Helga Hufflepuff, the locket of Salazar Slytherin, and the diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw represented not merely convenient containers, but tangible connections to magical legacy that Tom sought to claim as his own inheritance. The diary, created during Tom's school years, and containing the soul fragment responsible for the Chamber of Secrets incidents, demonstrates how Horcruxes can maintain active connection to their creator's consciousness and even manifest independent agency when circumstances allow sufficient magical energy to accumulate within the container. The diary's ability to communicate with Ginny Weasley, influence her behavior, and eventually achieve temporary physical manifestation, reveals that Horcruxes are not merely storage devices for soul fragments, but potentially autonomous entities capable of pursuing their creators' goals through methods that might diverge significantly from the original consciousness's preferred approaches. Nagini's transformation into living Horcrux represents innovation in soul fragment preservation that pushes the boundaries of Horcrux creation beyond traditional limitations imposed by using inanimate objects as containers. Living beings offer advantages that objects cannot provide. They can move independently, respond to changing circumstances, and maintain themselves through normal biological processes that eliminate many of the preservation challenges associated with inanimate Horcruxes. But living Horcruxes also create vulnerabilities that objects avoid. They can be killed through conventional means. They require ongoing care and feeding, and they may develop loyalties or motivations that conflict with their creator's intentions. The murder of Bertha Jorkins for the creation of Nagini as Horcrux demonstrates how Voldemort's approach to soul fragmentation evolved during his years of exile and diminished power. Where his earlier Horcrux creations had been planned in advance with careful selection of both victims and containers, the Nagini Horcrux represents more opportunistic approach that prioritized practical advantage over symbolic significance. Bertha's death served multiple purposes: eliminating a ministry employee who had discovered information about his survival, providing the murder necessary for soul fragmentation, and creating living Horcrux that could serve as companion and protector during his vulnerable period of physical reconstruction. The destruction of Horcruxes requires methods that extend far beyond normal magical damage, because the soul fragments they contain provide protection that transcends conventional defensive charms or physical durability. The objects themselves become enhanced by their connection to their creator's magic, developing resistances and defensive capabilities that reflect the power and knowledge of the wizard whose soul fragment they house. This enhancement explains why Dumbledore's attempts to destroy the Ring Horcrux nearly killed him despite his tremendous magical ability and extensive knowledge of protective countermeasures. The ring had become something more than jewelry enhanced by dark magic, transforming into entity that actively resisted destruction through methods that conventional magical theory could not anticipate or counter. Basilisk venom's effectiveness against Horcruxes stems from its nature as substance that destroys on levels deeper than physical or conventional magical damage, attacking the very life force that animates magical creatures and objects in ways that cannot be healed or reversed through normal magical medicine or repair charms. The venom's toxicity operates through principles that target essential magical signatures rather than merely physical structure, making it one of the few substances capable of inflicting damage so fundamental that even Horcrux-level protection cannot prevent or repair it. The Sword of Gryffindor's absorption of basilisk venom properties demonstrates how certain magical objects can be permanently altered by exposure to substances that operate on such fundamental levels, gaining capabilities that persist indefinitely without diminishing power or effectiveness. Fiendfire represents even more extreme approach to Horcrux destruction, employing magical flame that consumes not merely physical material but magical essence itself, burning through protective enchantments and spiritual barriers with equal facility. The fire's sentient nature allows it to adapt its destructive properties to overcome whatever resistance it encounters, making it nearly unstoppable once unleashed, but also extraordinarily dangerous to the wizard attempting to control it. The destruction of the Diadem Horcrux through Fiendfire in the Room of Requirement demonstrates both the fire's effectiveness against even the most powerfully protected Horcruxes and the catastrophic collateral damage that results When such forces are employed without perfect control and containment, the soul fragmentation process inflicts damage on the creator that extends far beyond the loss of portions of their essential self, creating a cascade of psychological and spiritual deterioration that accelerates with each additional Horcrux created. Voldemort's transformation from the handsome, charismatic Tom Riddle into the serpentine monstrosity he became reflects not merely physical changes wrought by dark magic usage, but fundamental alteration of his essential nature as the increasingly fragmented soul lost its capacity to maintain human appearance and psychology. Each murdered victim and each soul fragment bound to external container drove him further from humanity and deeper into forms of existence that transcended normal categories of life and death, while achieving neither the benefits of natural, mortal existence nor the peace of conventional mortality. The accidental Horcrux created within Harry Potter represents unprecedented variation in soul fragmentation that occurred without conscious intent or deliberate magical ritual, demonstrating that extreme circumstances can sometimes produce results that normally require extensive preparation and careful execution. Voldemort's attempted murder of infant Harry, combined with Lily's sacrificial protection and the subsequent rebounding of the killing curse, created magical conditions so unique and powerful that they accomplished soul fragmentation and transfer without the usual requirements of premeditated ritual and prepared container. The fragment of Voldemort's soul that attached itself to Harry represents not deliberate Horcrux creation, but magical accident that occurred at the moment when Voldemort's already damaged soul was subjected to forces that it could not withstand or control. Harry's unique status as living Horcrux, who retained his own consciousness and moral agency, demonstrates that soul fragments do not necessarily overwhelm or corrupt their containers if those containers possess sufficient strength of character and supporting magical protection. The fragment of Voldemort's soul within Harry remains subordinate to Harry's own consciousness throughout his development, providing abilities like Parseltongue, communication, and emotional connection to Voldemort without fundamentally altering Harry's essential nature or moral compass. This suggests that the corrupting influence of Horcruxes may depend as much on the receptivity and vulnerability of their containers as on the inherent evil of the soul fragments they house. The destruction of Voldemort's soul fragment within Harry, through the killing curse in the Forbidden Forest, represents resolution of magical paradox that had persisted since the night of Harry's parents' murder, finally separating the accidentally mingled consciousness and allowing both Harry and Voldemort to exist as discrete entities without ongoing spiritual contamination. The process required Harry's willing acceptance of death and Voldemort's use of Harry's blood to reconstruct his own body, creating conditions where Lily's protective magic could operate to preserve Harry's life while allowing the destruction of the foreign soul fragment that had resided within him since infancy. The mutilation of Voldemort's soul through multiple Horcrux creation rendered him incapable of experiencing normal death or achieving conventional afterlife existence, trapping him in liminal state between life and death that offered neither the benefits of mortal existence nor the peace of natural mortality. The pathetic, flayed creature glimpsed in the King's Cross vision represents what remains of consciousness that has been too thoroughly fragmented to maintain coherent identity or achieve resolution through conventional death. This ultimate fate serves as warning about the true cost of pursuing immortality through methods that violate the fundamental principles governing the relationship between soul, consciousness, and the natural progression from life through death to whatever existence awaits beyond the mortal realm. The deliberate withholding of complete Horcrux creation instructions reflects understanding that some knowledge is too dangerous to be preserved in any form that might enable future misuse, that the protection of society sometimes requires accepting permanent loss of information that might otherwise contribute to magical understanding and scholarly advancement. The decision to suppress, rather than study, represents acknowledgement that certain forms of magical knowledge carry costs that exceed any possible benefits, that the pursuit of complete understanding must sometimes be subordinated to the protection of moral and spiritual integrity that makes such understanding meaningful rather than merely destructive. In the shadows, where such forbidden knowledge lurks, waiting to corrupt those foolish enough to seek power through methods that destroy everything valuable about existence itself, the true horror of Horcrux creation becomes clear. It represents not achievement of immortality, but embrace of spiritual death that leaves its practitioners trapped between existence and non-existence, powerful but empty, persistent but purposeless, surviving, but never truly alive. The fragments of soul bound to objects or creatures become monuments to the fundamental truth that consciousness divided against itself cannot stand, that identity fractured beyond natural limits loses coherence and meaning, that the pursuit of immortality, through violation of natural law, leads not to eternal life, but to eternal emptiness that mocks every hope for transcendence or peace. The human soul, that essential spark of consciousness that animates mortal flesh and transforms electrical impulses into thoughts, emotions, and the ineffable sense of being that marks the difference between person and object, was never meant to be divided against itself. In the natural order of existence, the soul exists as unified whole, an integrated essence that maintains coherence across decades of growth, change, and experience, preserving identity through transformations that alter every cell in the body while leaving the fundamental self recognizably continuous. But in the twisted laboratories of dark magic, where natural law bends before the force of will applied without wisdom or restraint, even this most fundamental aspect of existence can be shattered, torn apart through acts so profoundly evil that they create wounds in the fabric of being itself. Voldemort's soul, once whole and human despite the darkness that had begun to corrupt it during his years at Hogwarts, was systematically destroyed through a series of murders so calculated and deliberate that each killing created fractures that could never heal naturally. The number 7, long recognized in magical theory as possessing special significance and power, became the framework for his spiritual self-destruction as he sought to divide his essence into 7 pieces, believing that such fragmentation would provide protection against death while maintaining enough coherence to preserve his identity and ambitions across centuries or millennia of existence. But the mathematics of soul division proved far more complex and dangerous than his teenage brilliance had anticipated when he first learned of Horcrux theory from Professor Slughorn's reluctant instruction. Each murder tore away not merely a fragment of predetermined size, but a portion of himself that carried with it essential qualities of consciousness, memory, and moral capacity that could not be easily calculated or replaced. The first killing diminished him in ways that made the second easier to commit and less morally troubling to contemplate. The second death he caused created changes that made the third seem not merely acceptable, but necessary for the completion of his grand design. By the time he had created his 6th intentional Horcrux, binding the final fragment of his planned septet into Nagini's serpentine form, Tom Riddle had effectively ceased to exist as coherent human being. The handsome, charismatic student who had charmed professors and manipulated fellow students through subtle influence and intellectual superiority had been replaced by something that retained his memories and ambitions while losing most of what had made those memories meaningful, or those ambitions comprehensible to minds that remained whole and undivided. The seventh fragment, accidentally torn from his already mutilated soul during his attempt to murder infant Harry Potter, represented damage beyond anything he had intended or prepared for. Where his previous soul divisions had been controlled exercises in spiritual fragmentation, performed under carefully planned conditions with prepared containers ready to receive and protect the severed portions of his essence, the trauma inflicted by his curse, rebounding from Harry's protected infant form, created wounds so severe that the fragment torn away attached itself to the nearest available magical vessel without any conscious direction or ritual preparation. Harry Potter's unique status as accidental Horcrux created paradox that challenged every assumption about how soul fragments behaved when separated from their original consciousness. Unlike the intentionally created Horcruxes, which existed as static repositories of Voldemort's essence preserved at the moment of their creation, the fragment within Harry continued to develop and change, apparently influenced by Harry's own growth and moral development, while simultaneously providing its unwilling host with abilities and insights that no normal wizard could possess. The connection between Harry's mind and Voldemort's consciousness, mediated by the soul fragment that linked them across any distance and through most magical barriers, created unprecedented situation where two separate beings shared thoughts, emotions, and experiences in ways that neither fully understood or controlled. Harry's ability to sense Voldemort's emotional state, to experience his rage and satisfaction and fear as if they were his own feelings, stemmed not from conventional magical bonds, but from the spiritual contamination that occurred when foreign soul fragment took residence within his consciousness. The pain that frequently lanced through Harry's scar represented physical manifestation of spiritual conflict between the soul fragment's desire to rejoin its master and Harry's own essential nature, which instinctively rejected the foreign presence, while being unable to expel it through conscious effort or magical intervention. The fragment, torn from Voldemort's consciousness at moment of greatest trauma and rage, carried with it not merely memories or abilities but emotional resonances that created sympathetic responses in Harry's own psyche, forcing him to experience echoes of Voldemort's hatred, ambition, and contempt for human weakness. But perhaps most remarkably, the fragment also served as conduit for information flow in both directions, allowing Harry to glimpse Voldemort's plans and activities, while potentially providing Voldemort with access to Harry's thoughts and experiences. This two-way connection created strategic vulnerabilities that both wizards attempted to exploit while struggling to protect their own mental privacy from unwanted intrusion by consciousness that they viewed as fundamentally hostile to their own values and objectives. The fragment's influence on Harry's abilities extended far beyond simple mental connection to include transfer of magical capabilities that should have been impossible according to conventional magical theory. Parseltongue, the rare ability to communicate with serpents through magical speech that bypassed normal language barriers, had been inherited by Voldemort from his ancestor Salazar Slytherin and represented bloodline magic that should have been untransferable to individuals without the proper genealogical connections. Yet Harry's possession of Voldemort's soul fragment granted him full access to this ability, allowing him to understand and speak snake language with fluency that matched Voldemort's own skills. The implications of such ability transfer raised disturbing questions about the nature of magical inheritance and the relationship between consciousness, genetic heritage, and supernatural capabilities. If soul fragments could carry with them not merely memories and personality traits, but actual magical abilities tied to bloodline inheritance, then the boundaries between individual magical identities became far more permeable than traditional magical theory assumed. The possibility that consciousness itself might be more transferable and divisible than previously understood challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mind, body, and magical core that governed everything from healing practices to educational methodology. Nagini's transformation into living Horcrux created even more complex questions about the interaction between soul fragments and their containers, particularly when those containers possessed their own consciousness and magical abilities. The giant serpent's fanatical loyalty to Voldemort, her apparent understanding of his commands and desires, even when not explicitly communicated, and her willingness to serve as both protector and weapon, suggested that the soul fragment within her had achieved integration with her natural serpentine consciousness in ways that the inanimate Horcruxes could not replicate. But the relationship between Voldemort and Nagini also raised troubling possibilities about the nature of the pain and spiritual conflict that Harry experienced as unwilling Horcrux. If Nagini felt the same urgent pull toward her master, the same spiritual yearning for reunification that caused Harry's scar to burn with increasing intensity when Voldemort was emotionally active, then her devotion might stem not from natural serpentine loyalty, but from constant spiritual agony that could be relieved only by proximity to the consciousness from which her soul fragment had been torn. The idea that Nagini might exist in a state of permanent spiritual suffering, experiencing continuous psychological pressure to reunite with Voldemort while being unable to achieve the complete integration that would end her torment, transformed her from willing servant into tragic victim whose apparent contentment masked depths of anguish that no external observer could fully comprehend. Her aggressive protection of Voldemort and her immediate response to his emotional states might represent not loyalty, but desperate attempts to ease spiritual pain that intensified whenever distance or circumstances prevented close contact with her master. The inanimate Horcruxes presented their own unique questions about consciousness, awareness, and the potential for soul fragments to develop independent agency when provided with sufficient time and magical energy. The diary's ability to communicate with Ginny Weasley, to influence her behavior through written conversation, and eventually to manifest Tom Riddle's 16-year-old form within the Chamber of Secrets, demonstrated that soul fragments retained far more active consciousness than their static appearance suggested. The diary Tom possessed memories, personality, and goals that remained consistent with the young Voldemort, while also showing capacity for adaptation and strategic thinking that indicated genuine awareness rather than mere preservation of past mental states. The locket's psychological assault on those who wore it revealed different approach to consciousness, preservation, and external influence, suggesting that soul fragments could retain not merely memories and personality, but active malevolence that sought to corrupt and destroy anyone who came into contact with them. The locket's ability to identify and exploit the deepest fears and insecurities of its wearers, its success in turning Ron Weasley against his closest friends through carefully targeted psychological manipulation, indicated sophisticated understanding of human psychology that went far beyond simple preservation of Voldemort's memories from the time of its creation. The possibility that Horcruxes could continue to develop and learn during their existence as separate entities opened disturbing questions about the ultimate fate of soul fragments that remained bound to containers for extended periods. If the diary fragment had indeed grown and changed during its decades of existence at Hogwarts, developing knowledge and capabilities that the original Tom Riddle had never possessed, then the other Horcruxes might have undergone similar evolution, becoming entities that diverged significantly from their creator while retaining enough of his essential nature to serve his ultimate purposes. The interaction between multiple Horcruxes, should they ever be brought into close proximity, represented theoretical scenario that magical scholarship had never seriously examined because the creation of even a single Horcrux was considered so unlikely and abhorrent that multiple examples seemed purely academic concern. But the possibility that Voldemort's various soul fragments might recognize each other and attempt reunion if gathered together raised questions about whether the artificial separation between fragments could be maintained indefinitely, or whether they possessed inherent tendency to seek reunification, even without their creator's conscious direction. The magical mechanics that allowed soul fragments to exist independently while maintaining connection to their original consciousness challenged every assumption about the nature of identity and the relationship between consciousness and physical or magical substrate. The fragments demonstrated awareness, memory, and purposeful behavior while being separated from the magical core and physical brain that normally served as foundation for conscious experience, suggesting that consciousness itself might be far more independent of material substrate than magical medicine or educational theory had ever recognized. The King's Cross vision that allowed Harry to glimpse the pitiful, flayed creature that represented Voldemort's final soul fragment provided the only direct observation of what remained of consciousness that had been too thoroughly divided to maintain coherent identity. The creature's apparent suffering, its inability to be helped or healed despite Dumbledore's presence and power, demonstrated that soul fragmentation beyond certain limits created damage so fundamental that even death could not provide relief or resolution. The creature's location beneath the bench, hidden and apparently ashamed of its own existence, suggested that whatever remained of Voldemort's original consciousness retained enough awareness to recognize the horror of what it had become, while being powerless to change or escape its diminished condition. The pathetic nature of the creature, so different from the commanding presence that Voldemort maintained in his reconstructed body, indicated that the process of soul division had created separation not merely between fragments, but between Voldemort's public persona and the essential self that bore the full weight of his spiritual mutilation. Dumbledore's assessment that the creature was beyond help reflected understanding that some forms of spiritual damage transcended the healing capabilities of even the most powerful magic, that consciousness divided beyond natural limits could not be restored to wholeness through external intervention, regardless of the skill or compassion of those attempting to provide assistance. The creature's fate served as warning about the ultimate consequences of pursuing power through methods that violated the fundamental principles governing the relationship between soul, identity, and the natural progression from life through death to whatever existence awaited beyond mortal boundaries. The destruction of each Horcrux eliminated not merely the object or creature that had served as container, but the portion of Voldemort's consciousness that had been bound within it, creating a form of death that transcended physical destruction to encompass spiritual obliteration. Unlike conventional death, which in the wizarding world offered possibilities for continuation as ghost or progression to whatever afterlife awaited, the destruction of soul fragments appeared to represent absolute ending, complete cessation of whatever awareness or capability for experience the fragments had possessed during their separated existence. The implications of such complete destruction raised theological and philosophical questions that magical scholarship was ill-equipped to address, touching on fundamental mysteries about the nature of consciousness, the meaning of individual identity, and the ultimate fate of awareness that had been artificially separated from its natural foundations. If soul fragments could be utterly destroyed rather than merely transformed or relocated, then consciousness itself might be more fragile and contingent than religious or philosophical traditions had assumed. dependent on maintaining certain organizational structures that could be disrupted beyond any possibility of recovery or continuation. Voldemort's final fate, trapped in liminal state between life and death, with his mutilated soul, unable to achieve either conventional mortality or peaceful afterlife existence, represented the ultimate consequence of pursuing immortality through methods that destroyed everything valuable about life itself. His consciousness, too thoroughly fragmented to maintain coherent identity yet too persistent to accept natural death, existed in state of permanent spiritual agony that offered neither the satisfaction of continued earthly existence nor the release that death might have provided to soul that had remained whole and integrated throughout its mortal journey. The horror of such existence extended beyond personal suffering to encompass recognition that consciousness could become its own prison, that awareness without the possibility of growth, connection, or meaningful experience might represent fate worse than simple non-existence. Voldemort's pursuit of immortality had achieved its goal in the most terrible way possible, creating form of eternal existence that preserved his consciousness, while eliminating everything that could make such consciousness valuable or meaningful. In the realm where souls fragment and consciousness divides against itself, where identity becomes collection of competing pieces rather than unified whole, the true meaning of spiritual integrity becomes clear. The soul's natural tendency toward wholeness and integration represents not merely biological drive, but fundamental principle of existence that maintains meaning and coherence across the transformations and challenges that mark every conscious being's journey through life toward whatever destination awaits beyond mortal understanding. In the deepest chambers of magical theory, where ancient forces intersect with human emotion to create power that transcends every limitation imposed by wand, spell, or scholarly understanding, there exists a form of protection, so profound and mysterious that even the greatest wizards can only observe its effects without truly comprehending the mechanisms that make such miracles possible. Love, when expressed through willing sacrifice for another's preservation, transforms from simple emotion into cosmic force that rewrites the fundamental laws governing life, death, and the relationship between individual consciousness and the larger patterns of existence that connect every soul to the eternal rhythms of creation itself. Lily Potter's choice on that terrible Halloween night in 1981 represented far more than maternal instinct or desperate courage in the face of impossible odds. When she positioned herself between Voldemort and her infant son, knowing that her death was certain but Harry's survival might be possible, she invoked magical principles so ancient and powerful that they predated wand magic, formal spellcasting, and every form of learned sorcery that had developed during centuries of wizarding civilization. Her sacrifice activated protections that existed in the very foundation of magical law, forces that operated according to rules written into the fabric of reality itself, by whatever intelligence or cosmic principle had established the boundaries between love and hatred, creation and destruction, hope and despair. The magic that preserved Harry's life operated through mechanisms that no textbook had ever described, and no scholarly research had ever successfully analyzed, drawing power not from external sources but from the willing surrender of life itself when offered freely and without expectation of reward or recognition. Lily's protection worked not because she was particularly powerful or learned in defensive magic, but because her love for Harry transcended every consideration of personal survival, comfort, or desire, transforming her final moments from simple death into active consecration that blessed her son with immunity to the darkest forces that Voldemort could command. The blood charm that anchored Lily's protection within Harry's very flesh represented innovation in ancient magic that required understanding of genealogical connections and familial bonds that extended far beyond normal magical kinship research. The protection could not simply exist as abstract blessing or temporary enchantment, but needed physical foundation that would persist through years of growth and change, maintaining its effectiveness even as Harry's body developed from infant form to adult strength, while the magical and emotional threats around him evolved in complexity and power. Petunia Dursley's blood relationship to her sister provided the crucial magical anchor that allowed Lily's sacrifice to continue protecting Harry throughout his childhood and adolescence, creating sanctuary at Privet Drive that no dark magic could penetrate as long as Harry could call the house his home in any meaningful sense. The protection worked not through Petunia's conscious cooperation or magical ability, neither of which she possessed, but through the simple fact of shared heritage that connected her to Lily's sacrifice, through bonds that transcended individual personality, mutual affection, or voluntary participation in protective schemes. The requirements for maintaining such protection revealed the delicate balance between magical law and human emotion that governed the operation of sacrificial magic. Harry's residence with the Dursleys had to represent genuine home rather than mere temporary shelter, requiring some degree of acceptance and belonging that could not be manufactured through legal documents or administrative arrangements, but had to emerge from lived experience and emotional reality, however minimal or grudging that reality might be. The 17-year limitation on the protection's effectiveness reflected magical understanding of adulthood and independence that recognized the transition from childhood dependence to adult autonomy as fundamental boundary in Fausting's human development that even the most powerful magic could not ignore or circumvent. The protection that had preserved Harry throughout his vulnerable years would naturally dissolve as he achieved legal majority, requiring new forms of defense and different approaches to survival that acknowledged his transformation from protected child to wizard responsible for his own safety and the safety of others who might depend upon his strength and courage. Voldemort's decision to use Harry's blood in his resurrection ritual represented strategic miscalculation of catastrophic proportions, born from incomplete understanding of the magical principles that governed Lily's sacrifice and the ongoing protection it provided to her son. His intention was simple and seemingly logical. By incorporating Harry's blood into his new body, he would bypass the protection that had prevented him from touching Harry during their encounter at the end of Harry's first year, eliminating the physical barrier that had caused him such agony when he attempted direct contact with his intended victim. But the Dark Lord's analysis failed to account for the deeper magical implications of taking Harry's blood into his own body, creating connection between Destroyer and Protected that fundamentally altered the relationship between them in ways that neither could initially understand or control. The blood that Voldemort incorporated into his resurrection carried with it not merely Harry's physical essence, but the spiritual protection that Lily's sacrifice had woven into her son's very being, establishing bond between Harry and his greatest enemy that would ultimately prove to be Voldemort's undoing rather than Harry's vulnerability. The ironic consequence of Voldemort's strategic decision became apparent only during Harry's willing walk to death in the Forbidden Forest, when the killing curse that should have ended his life instead destroyed the Horcrux fragment that had resided within him since infancy, while leaving his essential consciousness intact and capable of return to his body. The protection that flowed through both Harry's blood and Voldemort's reconstructed form created magical paradox where the curse could not kill Harry completely because his sacrificed blessed blood continued to exist within his enemy's body, maintaining spiritual anchor that prevented his complete separation from mortal existence. The mechanics of Harry's survival represented resolution of magical puzzle that had existed since the night of his parents' murder, finally separating his consciousness from the foreign soul fragment that had contaminated his spiritual essence, while preserving his essential identity through protective magic that had been strengthened rather than weakened by Voldemort's attempt to circumvent it. The King's Cross vision that allowed Harry to choose between continued existence and whatever lay beyond death demonstrated that sacrificial protection could extend even into liminal spaces between life and mortality, providing options and possibilities that normal death would not have offered. Harry's own decision to walk willingly to his death in the Forbidden Forest, knowing that his sacrifice might provide protection to the defenders of Hogwarts, represented conscious repetition of his mother's choice, elevated to strategic level, that encompassed not single child, but entire community of people who had chosen to resist Voldemort's authority, despite overwhelming odds against their success. His sacrifice activated the same ancient magical principles that had protected him throughout his life, extending similar immunity to dark magic among all those who fought in defense of the school that had become symbol of resistance to tyranny and oppression. The effectiveness of Harry's sacrifice became immediately apparent during the final battle, when Voldemort's spells failed to achieve their intended effects against opponents who should have been helpless before his power and experience. The silencing charms that should have prevented his enemies from casting counterspells simply dissolved upon contact with their intended targets. The binding curses that should have rendered them immobile and defenseless proved unable to maintain their magical grip on individuals who had been blessed by Harry's willing surrender of life for their protection. The ancient nature of sacrificial magic revealed itself through the way it operated according to principles that transcended formal spellcasting and learned magical technique, drawing power from emotional and spiritual sources that existed independently of the structured magic taught in schools and practiced by professional wizards. The protection worked not because specific incantations had been spoken or particular wand movements had been performed, but because genuine love expressed through willing sacrifice created resonances in the fundamental magical fabric that connected all conscious beings to the larger patterns of existence that governed the relationship between individual souls and cosmic order. The relational aspects of sacrificial magic distinguished it from every other form of protective enchantment by its dependence on connections between people rather than individual magical ability or technical knowledge. Lily's protection of Harry worked because of their relationship as mother and child, not because of her skills as witch or her power as magic user. Harry's protection of Hogwarts defenders succeeded because of his genuine care for their welfare and his willingness to die to ensure their survival, not because he had achieved mastery of particular spells or defensive techniques. The inability to replicate sacrificial protection through deliberate magical study or systematic research reflected its fundamental dependence on authentic emotion and genuine choice, rather than technical procedure or academic understanding. Love could not be manufactured or simulated for magical purposes, and sacrifice could not achieve protective effects unless it emerged from sincere willingness to surrender life for another's benefit, without expectation of reward, recognition, or personal advantage from the act of surrender. The rarity of successful sacrificial magic throughout wizarding history stemmed not from lack of knowledge about its theoretical possibility, but from the extreme circumstances required to activate such protection and the moral purity necessary to ensure its effectiveness. Most situations that might seem to call for sacrificial protection involved complex motivations, partial commitment, or hope for personal survival that prevented the complete surrender of self-interest necessary to invoke the ancient magical laws governing such profound forms of magical defense. The few documented cases of successful sacrificial protection revealed patterns that suggested certain conditions were more conducive to activating such magic than others. The protection seemed most effective when offered by individuals whose love for their intended beneficiaries was complete and unconditional, when the sacrifice was made in full knowledge of its consequences, and when the circumstances left no possibility for alternative solutions that might preserve both protector and protected through less extreme measures. The theological implications of sacrificial magic challenged both secular magical theory and religious understanding of the relationship between divine power and human action, suggesting that love itself might represent force in the universe that operated according to principles that transcended normal causality and rational explanation. The magic worked not because it followed natural laws that could be studied and understood, but because it tapped into fundamental aspects of existence that connected individual consciousness to larger patterns of meaning and purpose that governed the relationship between creation and destruction, hope and despair, life and death. The Department of Mystery's decision to maintain a locked room devoted to studying love reflected institutional recognition that such forces represented legitimate area of magical research despite their resistance to conventional analytical methods and their dependence on factors that could not be controlled or manipulated through normal experimental procedures. The room's permanent sealed status suggested that the unspeakables had discovered truths about love's power that were too dangerous or too profound to be shared with the broader magical community, forces that might be more wonderful and terrible than death itself because they operated on levels of reality that transcended mortal understanding while remaining intimately connected to human experience and emotion. The practical applications of sacrificial magic extended beyond individual protection to encompass broader questions about the nature of magical defense and the relationship between personal virtue and supernatural capability. If love expressed through willing sacrifice could create protection that transcended every form of dark magic, then the most effective defense against evil might not involve mastery of particular spells or accumulation of magical power, but cultivation of emotional and spiritual qualities that enabled individuals to place others' welfare above their own survival and comfort. The educational implications of such understanding would revolutionize approaches to defense against the dark arts instruction and magical security training, shifting emphasis from technical proficiency and tactical knowledge to character development and relationship building that prepared students not merely to fight dark wizards, but to embody values that made such fighting meaningful rather than merely practical. The strongest protection against corruption and evil might emerge not from paranoid vigilance or sophisticated countermeasures, but from depth of love and commitment that made individuals willing to sacrifice everything rather than betray those who depended upon their protection. The inheritance patterns of sacrificial protection remained largely mysterious, with no clear evidence that such magic could be passed directly from parent to child or transmitted through bloodline inheritance in the manner of other magical abilities and traits. Each instance of successful sacrifice seemed to require independent choice and authentic emotion from the individual making the sacrifice, suggesting that the protection could not be manufactured or preserved through external means, but had to emerge fresh from each generation's willingness to place love above self-preservation when circumstances demanded such terrible choices. But the influence of sacrificial protection on family magical heritage remained an area of active speculation among scholars who studied the intersection between genealogy and supernatural ability. Children whose parents had died protecting them might inherit not specific magical capabilities, but increased sensitivity to the emotional and spiritual forces that governed sacrificial magic. making them more likely to recognize situations where such protection might be necessary, and more capable of providing it when circumstances called for ultimate expressions of love and commitment. The connection between sacrificial protection and other forms of ancient magic suggested that love might serve as foundation for magical abilities that transcended formal spellcasting and learned technique, providing access to powers that operated according to principles written into the fundamental structure of magical reality, rather than developed through academic study or practical experience. The protection worked because it aligned with cosmic forces that govern the relationship between individual consciousness and universal patterns of meaning, tapping into sources of power that existed independently of human knowledge, while remaining accessible to anyone whose love was pure enough and whose commitment was complete enough to activate such profound magical responses. In the realm where love transcends every limitation imposed by mortality, fear, and rational calculation, where willing sacrifice transforms from personal tragedy into cosmic force that rewrites the fundamental laws of magical reality, the true meaning of protection becomes clear. The strongest shields are not cast through wands or anchored in objects, but woven from emotional connections that create bonds stronger than any material force, more persistent than any enchantment, more powerful than any curse that hatred can devise. In the space between heartbeats, where choice is made to place another's welfare above personal survival, magic becomes something far greater than technique or knowledge, transforming into expression of universal principles that connect individual consciousness to the eternal patterns of love that govern all existence. In the arcane workshops where wand makers practice their ancient craft, shaping wood and magical cores into instruments that serve as extensions of their wielder's will and channels for forces that exist beyond normal human comprehension, there occasionally occurs a phenomenon so rare and mysterious that even the most experienced artisans can only observe its effects without truly understanding the deeper magical principles that govern such extraordinary occurrences. When two wands are crafted with cores drawn from the same magical creature, sharing essence that was once unified within a single being, they retain connections to their common source that transcend the normal relationships between wizard and wand, creating bonds that operate according to ancient laws of magical sympathy and resonance that predate formal wand lore by countless centuries. The Phoenix Forks, whose tail feathers provided the magical cores for both Harry Potter's Holly Wand and Tom Riddle's Yew Wand, represented creatures of such profound magical nature that even individual feathers retained connection to the unified consciousness from which they had been taken, carrying with them not merely magical power, but spiritual essence that linked them to their source and to each other across any distance or obstacle that might separate them physically. The phoenix's unique nature as being capable of death and rebirth, of transformation through flame that destroyed physical form while preserving essential identity, imbued its feathers with properties that reflected these miraculous capabilities in subtle ways that most wand makers never fully understood or appreciated. Garrick Ollivander's selection of Fawkes's feathers for two of his finest wands demonstrated understanding of phoenix magic that extended beyond simple recognition of power to encompass appreciation for the complex spiritual qualities that such cores could bring to the instruments they animated. The phoenix's association with healing, loyalty, and the triumph of renewal over destruction made its feathers particularly suitable for wands destined to serve wizards whose lives would be marked by conflict between light and darkness, hope and despair, creation and annihilation on scales that would test every assumption about the proper relationship between wizard and magical instrument. But Ollivander's knowledge of twin core phenomena, extensive though it was, remained largely observational rather than theoretical. based on centuries of careful documentation about how such wands behaved in various circumstances, rather than deep understanding of the magical mechanisms that produce such behavior. He could predict with reasonable accuracy what would happen when twin core wands encountered each other in combat, but he could not explain why the cores recognized each other, or what forces compelled them to resist normal dueling dynamics in favor of the strange communion that magical scholarship had termed priori incantatum. The holly and yew woods chosen for these particular wands added additional layers of symbolic and magical significance that reinforced the deeper connections between their cores, creating instruments that were perfectly suited to their eventual owners, while also being perfectly matched against each other in ways that would prove crucial during the climactic confrontations that would determine the fate of the wizarding world. Holly, with its associations with protection and the triumph of life over death, provided ideal foundation for a wand destined to serve someone whose entire existence would be defined by survival against impossible odds and the protection of others against forces that threatened to consume everything good and beautiful. In the magical world, yew, with its connections to death, transformation, and the darker aspects of magical power, created perfect complement to holly's life-affirming properties, while also serving as appropriate channel for magic that would be used to explore the boundaries between existence and non-existence, identity and dissolution, power and the corruption that power could bring to those who pursued it without wisdom or restraint. The combination of yew wood with phoenix core created an instrument capable of channeling both creative and destructive forces with equal facility, making it suitable for wizard, whose ambitions would lead him to experiment with magic that transcended every normal boundary and limitation. The first encounter between these twin core wands in the graveyard of Little Hangleton revealed magical phenomenon so unprecedented that even Voldemort, despite his extensive knowledge of wand lore and magical theory, found himself unprepared for the forces that erupted when his curse met Harry's desperate defensive magic. The golden thread that formed between their wands represented visible manifestation of the connection that had always existed between the phoenix feathers at their cores, a spiritual bond that transcended physical separation and individual ownership to create unity that neither wizard could fully control or comprehend. The mechanism by which this connection manifested defied every assumption about how magical combat normally proceeded, replacing the usual dynamics of attack and defense with something approaching mystical communion, where the wands themselves became active participants in determining the outcome rather than mere tools for channeling their wielders' intentions. The golden thread that linked them carried more than magical energy. It conveyed information, emotion, and something approaching consciousness that operated independently of either Harry's or Voldemort's direct control, creating a situation where the instruments of magic began to dictate terms to the wizards who believed themselves to be their masters. The beads of light that moved along the connecting thread represented concentrations of magical force that responded not to the conscious commands of either duelist, but to deeper currents of will, determination, and spiritual strength that operated below the level of rational thought and deliberate strategy. Harry's success in forcing the beads back toward Voldemort's wand stemmed not from superior magical technique or greater raw power, but from qualities of character and purpose that the Phoenix cores recognized and responded to, choosing to support the wizard whose intentions aligned more closely with the Phoenix's essential nature of healing, renewal, and protection. When the connection reached its climax, and Voldemort's wand began regurgitating echoes of its most recent spells, the phenomenon revealed magical principles that challenged every assumption about the relationship between wands, magic, and the persistence of spiritual energy after physical death. The echoes that emerged were not mere replays of past magical events, but something approaching resurrection of consciousness, temporary restoration of awareness, that allowed the dead to communicate with the living in ways that normal magic could not facilitate. The figures of Cedric Diggory, Frank Bryce, Bertha Jorkins, James Potter, and Lily Potter, who materialized from Voldemort's wand, possessed enough coherent consciousness to recognize Harry, understand the dangerous circumstances in which he found himself, and provide assistance that proved crucial to his escape from what should have been certain death. Their ability to speak, to express concern and love, to coordinate their actions in support of Harry's desperate flight, indicated that the Echoes retained far more of their original personalities and memories than Dumbledore's later description as mere echoes might suggest to casual consideration. The mechanics of how Echoes could possess such apparent consciousness remained one of the deepest mysteries of priori incantatem phenomenon, challenging fundamental assumptions about the nature of death, the persistence of identity after physical destruction, and the relationship between magical instruments and the spiritual essence of those affected by the magic they channeled. The wand that had killed these individuals had somehow preserved not merely the magical signatures of the killing curses, but something approaching the spiritual essence of those who had died, maintaining this information in forms that could be accessed and temporarily manifested under the proper circumstances. The question of why victim wands, rather than aggressor wands, underwent the regurgitation effect reflected deeper magical principles about the relationship between action and consequence, between the exercise of power and the responsibility that such exercise created. Voldemort's wand, as the instrument that had performed the killings, bore magical responsibility for the lives it had taken, carrying within its core not merely the memory of magical energy expended, but spiritual debt that could be called upon when circumstances demanded accounting for the harm that had been inflicted through its agency. The reverse chronological order in which the Echoes appeared suggested that priori incantatem operated according to principles of magical archaeology, excavating layers of spiritual residue that had accumulated within the wand's core like sediment deposited by each successive use of lethal magic. The most recent deaths appeared first because their spiritual imprints remained closest to the surface of the core's consciousness, while older victims would presumably emerge in sequence if the phenomenon were allowed to continue long enough to reach the deepest layers of accumulated magical memory. But the temporary nature of the Echoes, their inability to maintain manifestation once the connection between wands was broken, indicated that priori incantatem represented borrowing rather than true resurrection, temporary access to spiritual information that remained stored within the wand rather than genuine return of consciousness from whatever realm the dead normally inhabited. The Echoes faded not because their time was limited by natural law, but because the magical connection that allowed their manifestation could not be maintained indefinitely against the enormous spiritual and magical stresses that such communion created for both wands and wielders. The selective nature of twin core recognition raised additional questions about the specificity required for such connections to manifest, and the broader implications for understanding how magical cores related to their sources and to each other. Fawkes had provided only 2 tail feathers to Ollivander during their association, creating unique situation where the Phoenix's magical essence was divided between exactly 2 instruments, rather than distributed among larger number of wands that might have complicated or diluted the connection between them. The possibility that other magical creatures might have provided cores for multiple wands without creating twin core effects suggested that Phoenix magic operated according to principles that differed fundamentally from the magical properties of dragons, unicorns, and other creatures whose body parts served as wand cores. The Phoenix's unique nature as being capable of death and rebirth, of maintaining identity across multiple cycles of physical destruction and spiritual renewal might have created magical cores that retained stronger connections to their source and to each other than cores derived from creatures whose existence followed more conventional patterns of birth, growth, and eventual death. The rarity of documented twin-core encounters throughout magical history reflected both the uncommon nature of the phenomenon and the reluctance of wand-makers to create multiple instruments from the same magical source, understanding that such connections could create unpredictable complications for the wizards who wielded such wands. Most magical creatures provided only single cores of sufficient quality and power to warrant use in high-quality wands, making twin cores exceptional circumstances that occurred only when creatures of extraordinary magical nature yielded multiple suitable components to skilled artisans who recognized their potential value. The strategic implications of twin-core phenomena for magical combat and law enforcement remained largely theoretical because of the rarity with which such situations arose. But the few documented cases suggested that wizards who found themselves facing opponents with matching cores needed to prepare for magical encounters that would follow entirely different rules from normal dueling dynamics. Traditional tactics of overwhelming force, superior technique, or strategic positioning became irrelevant when wands themselves took control of the combat situation and imposed their own logic on the proceedings. The emotional and spiritual demands placed on wizards during Priori Incantatem episodes exceeded anything that normal magical training could prepare them to handle, requiring forms of mental and moral strength that went far beyond technical proficiency or combat experience. The phenomenon appeared to respond to the deepest qualities of character and purpose that motivated each participant, making the connection as much test of worthiness as demonstration of magical capability. Harry's success in maintaining the connection long enough to trigger the echo effect, and then using that manifestation to facilitate his escape, demonstrated forms of courage, determination, and spiritual strength that transcended anything that formal magical education could teach or that practical experience could fully develop. His ability to draw strength from his connection to the echoes of his parents, to find hope in their temporary presence and guidance in their final words, reflected qualities of character that the Phoenix Cores recognized and supported, even when conscious magical technique might have proved inadequate to the challenges he faced. The Elder Wand's unique properties and its relationship to other wands created additional complexities in understanding how twin cores might interact with instruments of such legendary power and mysterious origins. The Elder Wand's reputation for transferring allegiance to wizards who defeated its previous owners suggested that it operated according to different principles from normal wands, responding more to demonstrations of power and conquest than to the gradual development of mutual understanding and respect that characterized most successful wand-wizard partnerships. But the Elder Wand's core, taken from the tail hair of a thestral, created connections to death and the unseen world that might have influenced how it would respond to twin core situations if such circumstances ever arose. The possibility that an Elder Wand encounter with a twin core might produce effects even more dramatic and dangerous than normal. Priori Incantatem represented theoretical scenario that wandlore scholars preferred not to contemplate too seriously, understanding that such knowledge might tempt individuals to seek out such confrontations for experimental purposes that could prove catastrophic for everyone involved. The broader implications of twin core phenomena for understanding the nature of magical instruments and their relationship to consciousness, identity, and spiritual essence challenged fundamental assumptions about the proper relationship between wizard and wand that had governed magical education and practice for centuries. If wands could retain spiritual imprints of those affected by their magic, could maintain connections to their magical cause sources, and could actively participate in determining the outcomes of magical encounters, then the instruments of magic possessed far more agency and awareness than traditional wand lore had ever acknowledged or explored. The possibility that all wands might possess some degree of consciousness or spiritual awareness, with twin core connections simply making such qualities more obvious and dramatic, opened questions about the ethics of wand creation, the rights and responsibilities of magical instruments, and the proper relationship between wizard and wand that treated the instrument as partner rather than mere tool. Such considerations would require fundamental changes in how magical education approached wand lore, how law enforcement dealt with wand-related crimes, and how society as a whole understood the nature of the magical tools that served as foundation for wizarding civilization. In the realm where consciousness extends beyond individual minds to encompass the spiritual essence preserved within magical instruments, where the echoes of the dead can speak through channels created by sympathetic cores, the true nature of magic reveals itself as something far more complex and mysterious than simple technique or learned skill, transforming into expression of universal principles that connect all consciousness across every boundary that normally separates the living from the dead, the past from the present, the individual from the eternal patterns of existence that govern all magical reality. In the deepest foundations of magical theory, where the very nature of supernatural force intersects with the fundamental laws that govern reality itself, there exist questions so profound and challenging that they have puzzled the greatest minds in wizarding history, without ever yielding satisfactory answers, or even adequate frameworks for understanding the true scope of what remains unknown. The limits of magic, if such limits exist at all, represent frontier territories of knowledge where theoretical speculation meets practical experience in ways that consistently reveal how little even the most accomplished witches and wizards truly understand about the forces they manipulate with such casual confidence in their daily lives. Gamp's law of elemental transfiguration stands as one of the few documented attempts to codify the boundaries of magical possibility, establishing 5 principal exceptions to the general rule that matter can be transformed from one state to another through properly applied magical force and appropriate incantation. The first exception, the inability to create food from nothing, reflects fundamental magical principle that authentic nourishment cannot be conjured from empty air, but must be summoned from existing sources, transformed from other organic matter, or multiplied from small quantities that already possess the essential properties necessary to sustain life and health. But the revelation of only one exception among 5 leaves 4 crucial limitations unexplored and unexplained, creating gaps in magical understanding that suggest either deliberate concealment of dangerous knowledge or simple failure of magical scholarship. To investigate thoroughly the boundaries that constrain transfiguration and potentially other branches of magical practice. The absence of publicly available information about these remaining exceptions reflects either institutional decision to suppress potentially dangerous knowledge or academic negligence that has left fundamental questions about magical theory unexplored, despite their obvious importance to understanding how magic functions at its most basic level. The implications of unknown limitations extend far beyond academic curiosity to encompass practical questions about magical capability that affect everything from educational curriculum to law enforcement strategy, from medical treatment to military planning. If magic possesses inherent limitations that have never been properly documented or understood, then every magical practitioner operates under conditions of incomplete knowledge that could prove catastrophic when those unknown boundaries are encountered unexpectedly during critical situations where failure means death or disaster for large numbers of people. The weight limitations that seem to affect levitation magic present, particularly puzzling contradictions that challenge every assumption about how magical force relates to physical mass and gravitational attraction. First-year students at Hogwarts begin their practical education with feathers, objects so light that even minimal magical force can overcome their gravitational attraction and lift them from surfaces where they rest. The educational progression suggests that lighter objects require less magical energy to levitate, implying direct relationship between mass and the magical effort needed to counteract natural forces that normally keep objects grounded. But practical experience consistently contradicts this theoretical framework, demonstrating that magical levitation operates according to principles that have little connection to physical weight or mass. Harry and Ron's successful levitation of a mountain trolls club, an object that likely weighed several hundred pounds and should have required magical force proportional to its enormous mass, was accomplished with minimal additional effort compared to the feather exercises that had challenged them only weeks earlier. The club's successful levitation by students who had barely mastered basic spellcasting suggests that magical force operates according to rules that transcend normal physical limitations. The explanation for such contradictions may lie in understanding that magical levitation targets not the physical mass of objects but their essential magical signatures, the spiritual and metaphysical properties that define them as distinct entities within the magical field that surrounds and permeates all existence. Under this theoretical framework, a feather and a troll's club would present similar challenges to magical manipulation because both exist as coherent magical entities whose physical properties are less relevant to spellcasting success than their metaphysical characteristics and the clarity with which the casting wizard can perceive and interact with their essential magical nature. This interpretation suggests that the educational use of feathers in levitation instruction serves not to provide objects that are easier to lift, but to offer targets that minimize the consequences of failed spells or loss of magical control during the learning process. A feather dropped from magical levitation poses no threat to students or classroom fixtures, while a troll's club released from magical control could cause serious injury or property damage that would make practical magical education far more dangerous and expensive than current educational budgets could sustain. The distance limitations that affect summoning charms present additional puzzles about the relationship between magical force and physical space, suggesting that magical energy may dissipate over distance in ways that follow rules analogous to but distinct from the inverse square law that governs electromagnetic radiation and gravitational attraction. Harry's successful summoning of his firebolt during the Triwizard Tournament demonstrated that magical force could operate across considerable distances when properly applied. But the delay between casting and arrival suggested that magical energy required time to traverse space even when not constrained by physical barriers or interference. The implications of distance-dependent magical effects extend to every area of magical practice that involves interaction with remote objects or distant locations, from long-range communication spells to protective wards that must maintain effectiveness across large areas. If magical force weakens with distance according to predictable mathematical relationships, then defensive installations, emergency response protocols, and military strategies must account for such limitations in ways that current magical planning may not adequately address. The concentration requirements that govern successful spellcasting represent perhaps the most significant practical limitation on magical capability, constraining even the most powerful wizards to work within the boundaries of human attention span and mental focus. The observation that magical success correlates directly with the caster's ability to maintain clear mental images of desired outcomes suggests that magic responds not to mechanical technique or rote memorization, but to qualities of consciousness and mental discipline that vary enormously among individuals and can be severely compromised by fatigue, emotional stress, or external distractions. The implications of concentration-dependent magic for understanding the true limits of magical power suggest that theoretical boundaries may be far more flexible than practical constraints, with individual capability determined more by psychological and spiritual factors than by inherent limitations in the magical forces themselves. A wizard with perfect concentration and unlimited mental stamina might theoretically accomplish feats that seem impossible to practitioners who must work within normal human limitations of attention and focus. The possibility that attention deficit disorders or other neurological conditions that affect concentration might significantly impact magical ability raises troubling questions about equity and accessibility in magical education and professional practice. Students whose neurological makeup makes sustained concentration difficult might find themselves systematically disadvantaged in magical learning, despite possessing all the other qualities necessary for successful spellcasting, creating barriers to magical achievement that have nothing to do with innate magical capability or moral character. The theoretical market for attention-enhancing potions or magical treatments in magical society reflects recognition that concentration represents a crucial limiting factor in magical achievement, but the ethical implications of such pharmaceutical interventions in magical education raise questions about fairness, authenticity, and the proper relationship between natural ability and artificial enhancement that magical institutions have never seriously addressed, despite their obvious relevance to educational policy and professional standards. The creation of new spells represents an area of magical innovation that challenges every assumption about the relationship between discovery and invention, between natural law and artificial technique. The process by which magical practitioners develop new incantations, wand movements, and spell effects remains almost completely unexplored by magical scholarship, despite its fundamental importance to understanding how magic evolves and expands its capabilities over time. Luna Lovegood's mother died while attempting to create new spell, an event that demonstrates the inherent dangers involved in magical innovation, while revealing almost nothing about the specific risks or the precautionary measures that might prevent such tragedies in future experimental work. The absence of detailed information about spell creation processes reflects either deliberate suppression of dangerous knowledge or simple failure of magical academia to investigate systematically one of the most important aspects, magical development. The attribution of specific spells to individual creators, such as the cushioning charm invented for broomstick comfort or the severing charm developed by a seamstress for professional applications, suggests that spell creation responds to practical needs and professional requirements rather than abstract theoretical investigation. This pattern implies that magical innovation follows demand-driven development that focuses on solving specific problems rather than expanding magical knowledge for its own sake. Severus Snape's invention of Sectum Sempra during his student years at Hogwarts demonstrates that spell creation can occur even among relatively inexperienced practitioners, suggesting that the process depends more on creativity and magical intuition than on advanced education or extensive practical experience. The dark nature of Snape's creation also reveals the dangers inherent in unsupervised magical experimentation, particularly when conducted by individuals whose emotional state or moral development might lead them toward harmful applications of their innovative capabilities. The mechanism by which new spells acquire their incantations raises fundamental questions about the relationship between language and magical effect, between arbitrary verbal formulas and the deeper magical principles they seem to activate. The consistent use of Latin-derived incantations throughout European magical practice suggests either historical convention that has persisted for centuries without functional necessity, or deeper magical significance in the specific sounds and linguistic structures that accompany successful spellcasting. The possibility that incantations represent discovery rather than invention, that magical effects possess inherent true names that must be uncovered rather than created, would fundamentally alter understanding of spell development. From creative process to archaeological expedition, through layers of magical reality that exist independently of human knowledge or manipulation. Under this framework, spell creators would be explorers rather than inventors, uncovering magical effects that have always existed in potential form, while waiting for the right combination of intent, technique, and verbal formula to activate them. The dangers associated with experimental spell creation extend beyond personal risk to spell creators to encompass potential consequences for magical society as a whole, particularly when innovations produce effects that challenge existing legal frameworks or create new forms of harm that established protective measures cannot adequately address. The development of new curses, hexes, or jinxes could provide criminals and dark wizards with weapons that exceed the defensive capabilities of law enforcement or medical professionals, creating arms races between magical innovation and protective countermeasures. The regulation of spell creation research represents an area where magical law has failed to keep pace with technological development, leaving experimental magic largely unsupervised, despite its potential for creating weapons of mass destruction or other forms of magical effect that could threaten public safety on scales that individual spell creators might never anticipate or intend. The absence of licensing requirements, safety protocols, or institutional oversight for magical innovation reflects legislative gaps that could prove catastrophic if malicious individuals gain access to experimental techniques or if well-intentioned research produces uncontrolled magical effects. The theoretical limits of magical expansion raise questions about whether spell creation represents a genuinely open-ended process capable of infinite development, or whether fundamental constraints govern the total scope of magical effects that can be achieved regardless of human ingenuity or experimental dedication. If magical force operates according to conservation laws, analogous to those that govern physics, then new magical capabilities might require corresponding limitations or costs that maintain overall balance in the magical ecosystem. The relationship between magical cores and spellcasting capability suggests that individual limitations may be more significant constraints on magical achievement than theoretical boundaries inherent in magic itself. Wizards with powerful magical cores might be capable of effects that remain impossible for practitioners with weaker magical foundations, creating hierarchies of capability that reflect inherent rather than learned differences in magical potential. But the enhancement of magical cores through training, practice, or external intervention remains largely unexplored area of magical development that could potentially overcome individual limitations and expand the general boundaries of what magic can accomplish. If magical cores can be strengthened through appropriate exercises or enhanced through magical treatments, then the limits of individual capability might prove far more flexible than current understanding suggests. The interaction between multiple magical cores working in coordination presents theoretical possibilities for achieving magical effects that exceed the capabilities of individual practitioners, potentially breaking through limitations that constrain solo spellcasting, while creating new categories of magical achievement that require group effort and coordinated technique. The absence of systematic research into collaborative magic reflects missed opportunities for expanding magical capability through teamwork and shared magical resources. The fundamental question of what magic actually is, beyond simple description of its observable effects and practical applications, remains as mysterious as ever, despite centuries of magical education and research. The source of magical force, the mechanism by which human consciousness can influence physical reality through supernatural means. The relationship between magical ability and other aspects of human nature all remain unexplored territories that challenge every attempt at systematic understanding or theoretical framework. The possibility that magic represents fundamental aspect of consciousness rather than external force that consciousness can manipulate would revolutionize every approach to magical education, research, and practice, transforming magic from tool that can be learned and used to essential aspect of awareness that must be cultivated and integrated with other aspects of human development. Under such understanding, magical education would become form of consciousness development rather than technical training, with emphasis on spiritual growth and self-awareness, rather than spell memorization and wand technique. The relationship between magical ability and moral development remains unexplored, despite obvious relevance to questions about who should receive magical education, who should be granted access to powerful spells, and how magical society should protect itself against practitioners whose technical competence exceeds their moral wisdom. If magical power naturally correlates with moral responsibility, then magical education must address character development as seriously as technical instruction, preparing students not merely to cast spells effectively, but to use their capabilities in ways that serve justice and protect innocent people from harm. In the realm where consciousness meets cosmic force, to create effects that transcend every normal limitation imposed by physical law and rational understanding, the true scope of magical possibility remains forever beyond complete comprehension, inviting exploration and experimentation while warning against overconfidence in human ability to control or predict the ultimate consequences of wielding forces that exist beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding and stretch toward infinite potential that no single mind can fully grasp or responsibly direct. In the deepest chambers of magical research, where the ministry's most secretive departments grapple with forces that challenge every assumption about the nature of reality itself, there exist phenomena so fundamentally disturbing to conventional understanding that their very existence calls into question the basic principles governing consciousness, memory, and the relationship between individual identity and the flow of temporal experience. Time magic, that most dangerous and paradoxical of all supernatural arts, represents territory where human comprehension meets cosmic forces that operate according to rules, so alien to normal experience that even brief exposure to their effects can shatter minds unprepared for the implications of what it means to exist simultaneously in multiple moments of temporal reality. The time turner, that deceptively simple device that appears as nothing more than elegant hourglass suspended within rings of gleaming gold, contains within its crystalline chambers forces that transcend every limitation normally imposed by causality and sequential experience. The mechanism by which such devices manipulate the fundamental flow of time remains completely unknown to magical scholarship, hidden behind layers of theoretical complexity that exceed the analytical capabilities of even the most brilliant minds in the Department of Mysteries, where unspeakables spend their careers studying temporal phenomena without ever achieving true understanding of the principles that govern their operation. The sand that flows within time-turner chambers represents more than simple chronometric measurement but actual temporal substance, granules of crystallized time that have been somehow extracted from the normal flow of sequential experience and preserved in forms that can be manipulated through magical technique to create localized alterations in the relationship between individual consciousness and universal temporal progression. Each grain contains within its microscopic structure the accumulated weight of moments that have been borrowed from the natural order and held in suspension until circumstances require their release back into the stream of normal causality. The psychological effects of time travel extend far beyond simple disorientation or confusion to encompass fundamental challenges to personal identity and mental stability that arise when consciousness experiences temporal displacement. From its natural relationship to sequential reality, the human mind evolved to process experience in strictly chronological sequence, lacks adequate frameworks for integrating memories that originate from multiple temporal positions simultaneously, creating cognitive strain that can manifest as anything from mild confusion to complete psychological breakdown depending on the duration and complexity of temporal manipulation involved. The madness that supposedly results from seeing oneself during time travel represents more than simple psychological shock, but actual splitting of consciousness between temporal states that cannot be naturally reconciled within the normal structures of human identity and memory. When an individual encounters themselves from a different temporal position, they experience direct confrontation with the fundamental paradox of identity persistence across time, forcing recognition that the self exists as process rather than fixed entity, as pattern of consciousness that maintains continuity through change rather than stable structure that persists unchanged through temporal experience. But the interpretation of such madness as clinical mental illness may represent misunderstanding of the actual psychological effects involved, which might be better described as temporary disorientation rather than permanent damage to mental faculties. The shock of encountering oneself from a different temporal position creates confusion analogous to waking suddenly from vivid dream, requiring time for normal cognitive processes to reassert themselves and restore coherent relationship between consciousness and temporal experience. The possibility that madness from temporal displacement operates more as figure of speech than literal psychiatric condition suggests that the dangers of time travel may be more manageable than traditional warnings indicate, particularly for individuals who understand the theoretical basis for temporal manipulation and who have prepared psychologically for the disorientation that such experiences inevitably create. Knowledge of time-turner operation and mental preparation for temporal displacement might provide sufficient protection against the confusion that could otherwise prove overwhelming to unprepared minds. Hermione Granger's extensive use of time-turner technology throughout her third year at Hogwarts without apparent psychological damage demonstrates that repeated temporal displacement, when conducted with proper understanding and careful planning, need not result in the catastrophic mental effects that theoretical warnings suggest. Her ability to maintain multiple class schedules simultaneously, attending lectures that occurred at identical times, while preserving clear memories of each educational experience, indicates that human consciousness possesses greater flexibility for temporal manipulation than traditional magical theory acknowledges. The practical applications of controlled temporal displacement could revolutionize every aspect of magical society, from education and research to emergency response and criminal investigation, if the psychological risks could be adequately managed and the paradox potential properly controlled. Students could repeat classes to improve their understanding. Researchers could observe experimental results multiple times from different perspectives. Emergency responders could arrive at disaster scenes before damage occurred, and law enforcement could witness crimes as they happened, while maintaining their ability to prevent or respond to them effectively. But the Ministry's decision to destroy all time turners during the Battle of the Department of Mysteries reflected institutional recognition that the potential benefits of temporal manipulation were outweighed by the dangers, paradox creation, timeline alteration, and the possibility that such powerful devices could fall into the hands of individuals who would use them for personal advantage rather than public benefit. The elimination of time travel capability represented acknowledgement that some magical abilities are too dangerous for general use, regardless of their potential applications for solving societal problems. The Battle of the Department of Mysteries itself may have been orchestrated specifically to provide cover for the systematic destruction of time-turner technology, allowing Ministry officials to eliminate dangerous magical devices while attributing their loss to enemy action, rather than deliberate policy decision. Such interpretation would explain the seemingly coincidental timing of Voldemort's assault on the department that housed the wizarding world's most sensitive temporal research and experimental equipment. The subsequent development of new time-turner technology in the years following the original device's destruction demonstrates that the knowledge required for temporal manipulation survived, despite the loss of existing instruments preserved in research notes, theoretical frameworks, or the memories of unspeakables who had worked with the original devices. The creation of new temporal manipulation tools with different operational characteristics and safety features suggests that the destruction of the original time turners provided opportunity for technological advancement rather than permanent loss of capability. Memory magic, that subtle but profound art of consciousness manipulation, operates through mechanisms that remain as mysterious as the nature of consciousness itself, challenging every assumption about the relationship between individual identity and the accumulated experiences that seem to define personal history and character development. The ability to extract, alter, or implant memories represents power over the fundamental building blocks of personality and knowledge, transforming memory manipulation into a form of identity surgery that can reshape individuals in ways that transcend physical healing or conventional magical enhancement. The pensieve, that elegant basin carved from gleaming stone and filled with silvery substance that seems to exist in state between liquid and gas, serves as repository for memories that have been extracted from their original consciousnesses and preserved in forms that allow external observation and analysis. The magical mechanics that enable such memory extraction remain completely unknown, involving processes that somehow separate experiential information from the neural structures that normally house it, while preserving enough contextual detail to allow coherent replay of past events. The silvery substance within pensieve basins appears to be memory itself, given physical form, transformed from abstract pattern of neural activity into tangible medium that can be manipulated, combined with other memories, and experienced by consciousnesses other than those that originally created it. The ability to enter extracted memories and observe past events from perspectives other than that of the original experiencer suggests that memories contain information that transcends the subjective experience of individuals who lived through the events being remembered. Dumbledore's collection of memories related to Tom Riddle's transformation into Voldemort demonstrates how extracted memories can be analyzed like archaeological artifacts, studied for details and implications that might not have been apparent to their original owners during the actual experiences being preserved. The ability to review past events multiple times from different analytical perspectives transforms memory magic into an investigative tool that could revolutionize approaches to historical research, criminal investigation, and psychological analysis. But the reliability of memories as accurate records of past events remains questionable, complicated by the subjective nature of human perception and the ways in which memory naturally changes over time through processes of consolidation, reinterpretation, and integration with subsequent experiences. Memories stored in pensieves might preserve not objective records of past events, but subjective interpretations, filtered through the psychological state, emotional condition, and perceptual limitations of individuals who experienced them originally. The silver instrument in Dumbledore's office that helped him analyze theories about Voldemort's soul fragmentation represents extension of pensieve technology into real-time analytical applications, creating a device that could process theoretical scenarios and provide immediate feedback about their logical consistency and probable accuracy. The instrument's ability to manifest visual representations of complex magical theories suggests that memory magic encompasses not only preservation of past experiences, but manipulation of hypothetical scenarios and theoretical constructs. The possibility that pensieve technology could be expanded to create comprehensive memory analysis systems capable of comparing multiple accounts of identical events, identifying discrepancies that might indicate deception or false memory, and reconstructing probable sequences of past events from fragmentary or conflicting testimonies represents revolutionary advancement in truth-seeking capability that could transform legal proceedings, historical research, and interpersonal relationships throughout magical society. But such comprehensive memory analysis would also create unprecedented invasions of mental privacy, transforming every aspect of personal experience into potential evidence for external examination and judgment. The ethical implications of treating individual memories as public resources subject to governmental or institutional analysis challenge fundamental assumptions about personal autonomy, mental privacy, and the proper boundaries between individual consciousness and collective knowledge. The modification of memories, demonstrated through numerous examples of obliviation and more subtle alterations of recollection, represents power over individual identity that exceeds physical torture or conventional magical compulsion in its capacity to reshape personality and behavior through changes to the experiential foundation upon which consciousness builds. Its understanding of self and world. Memory modification can transform heroes into cowards, criminals into law-abiding citizens, lovers into strangers, creating changes in essential character that appear completely natural to their subjects, while serving the purposes of those who possess the knowledge and authority to implement such alterations. The ease with which memories can be modified, extracted, or completely erased suggests that individual consciousness may be far more malleable and vulnerable than normal experience indicates, dependent on maintaining accurate records of past experience for coherent identity and moral development. The possibility that personal history could be systematically altered without the subject's knowledge or consent represents a form of identity theft that transcends physical harm to encompass complete reconstruction of personality and Bayesian motivation. The long-term effects of extensive memory modification remain largely unexplored, despite the widespread use of obliviation in magical law enforcement and the regulation of wizard-muggle interactions. The cumulative psychological impact of repeated memory alterations the potential for modified memories to conflict with unconscious recollections or emotional responses, and the possibility that extensive obliviation could damage the fundamental cognitive structures that support memory formation and retrieval, all represent areas where current magical practice exceeds theoretical understanding of the pace, consequences involved. Magical portraits, those eerily lifelike paintings that seem to preserve consciousness long after their subjects' deaths, challenge every assumption about the relationship between individual identity and biological substrate, demonstrating that awareness, personality, and memory can persist in forms that have no obvious connection to the neural structures normally associated with consciousness and thought. The mechanisms that enable portrait consciousness remain completely mysterious, involving magical processes that somehow extract essential aspects of personality and preserve them in forms that can interact meaningfully with the living world, while existing independently of biological support systems. The limitations of portrait consciousness, their inability to learn new information beyond what their subjects knew at the time of their creation, suggests that magical portraits represent sophisticated copying rather than genuine continuation of individual awareness. But the portrait's ability to engage in complex conversations, to provide advice based on their preserved memories and personality patterns, and to demonstrate emotional responses to new situations, indicates that even copied consciousness can achieve remarkable sophistication and apparent authenticity. The relationship between portrait consciousness and the original individuals from whom it derives raises profound questions about the nature of identity and the meaning of personal continuity across different forms of existence. Are magical portraits genuine extensions of their subject's consciousness, preserved aspects of identity that maintain connection to whatever survives death, or sophisticated simulations that mimic personality patterns without possessing true awareness or subjective experience? The possibility that portrait creation represents form of partial immortality, preserving aspects of consciousness that can continue existing and interacting with the world indefinitely, suggests that death need not represent complete cessation of individual identity for those with sufficient magical knowledge and resources to create such preservation systems. But the limitations of portrait existence, confined to painted surfaces and dependent on magical maintenance for continued operation, indicate that such immortality comes with constraints that might make it less desirable than natural mortality, followed by whatever genuine afterlife might await. The question of whether portraits possess genuine free will or operate according to programmed responses based on their subjects' personality patterns affects fundamental understanding of what such preservation systems actually accomplish and whether they provide meaningful continuation of individual identity or merely sophisticated memorialization that creates illusion of persistence without genuine consciousness. The ethical implications of creating portrait consciousness without the explicit consent of subjects being preserved raise questions about posthumous identity rights and the proper limits of magical preservation technology. Ghost consciousness presents different challenges to understanding the relationship between individual identity and physical existence, demonstrating that some aspects of personality and memory can persist after biological death through mechanisms that remain completely unexplained by magical theory or religious doctrine. The voluntary nature of ghost existence, the apparent choice that dying individuals must make to remain connected to the mortal world rather than proceeding to whatever lies beyond, suggests that consciousness possesses greater autonomy and flexibility in relationship to physical existence than living experience indicates. But the limitations of ghost existence, their inability to affect the physical world directly, and their tendency to become increasingly detached from living concerns over time indicate that such persistence represents form of existence fundamentally different from normal life, rather than simple continuation of previous identity in alternative form. The gradual fading of ghost personality and interest in worldly affairs suggests that ghostly consciousness may be inherently unstable, slowly losing coherence and connection to individual identity as the factors that originally motivated the choice to remain in the mortal realm become less relevant or compelling. The ultimate mysteries of consciousness, preservation, and temporal manipulation remain as profound and challenging as ever, despite centuries of magical research and experimentation with devices and techniques that seem to offer glimpses into the fundamental nature of awareness, identity, and the relationship between individual minds, and the larger patterns of existence that connect every conscious being to cosmic forces that transcend normal understanding. In the realm where time flows backward and forward simultaneously, where memories become tangible objects that can be shared and analyzed, where consciousness persists in forms that challenge every assumption about the nature of awareness itself, the deepest questions about existence remain forever beyond complete comprehension, inviting exploration, while warning against overconfidence in mortal ability. To understand forces that operate according to principles that exceed the analytical capabilities of minds that exist within the very systems they seek to comprehend. In the ancient stones of Hogwarts Castle, where magic has settled into every brick and mortar joint like sediment deposited by centuries of accumulated wonder, there exist spaces that challenge every assumption about architecture, geography, and the relationship between physical structure and magical possibility. The castle that serves as Britain's premier magical educational institution represents far more than simple building constructed according to conventional principles of engineering and design, transforming instead into living entity whose consciousness expresses itself through architectural manipulation that creates, conceals, and transforms spaces according to needs and purposes that transcend normal understanding of how buildings relate to their inhabitants and users. The Room of Requirement stands as perhaps the most remarkable example of architectural magic that responds directly to human need and desire, manifesting physical spaces that exist only when circumstances call them into being, while remaining completely absent from normal castle geography when their services are not required. The magical mechanisms that govern the room's operation remain completely mysterious, despite extensive use by generations of students who have discovered its existence and learned to access its transformative capabilities for purposes ranging from innocent study sessions to elaborate training, programs that would have been impossible in conventional classroom settings. The room's ability to read the deepest needs and desires of those who approach it suggests consciousness that operates on levels far more sophisticated than simple mechanical response to external stimuli, demonstrating awareness of psychological states, emotional requirements, and practical necessities that may not be fully articulated even in the minds of individuals seeking its assistance. The room appears capable of understanding not only what people consciously desire but what they actually need for achieving their goals, sometimes providing resources and configurations that exceed explicit requests while remaining perfectly suited to underlying purposes that seekers themselves might not have fully recognized or understood. The transformation of the Room of Requirement into training facility for Dumbledore's army demonstrated the space's capacity for creating complex environments equipped with sophisticated magical training devices, defensive installations, and educational resources that would have required months of preparation and enormous expense if assembled through conventional means. The room's instantaneous generation of practice dummies that could simulate combat situations, protective barriers that could withstand student spellcasting, and storage systems that could organize and maintain extensive collections of defensive magical equipment suggested access to magical resources that transcended normal limitations of space, matter, and energy. But the room's most remarkable manifestation may have been its incarnation as the Room of Hidden Things, a vast repository that seemed to contain centuries of accumulated objects brought by students and staff members who needed secure storage for items too valuable, dangerous, or embarrassing to be kept in normal dormitory or office spaces. The sheer volume of material housed within the room during its storage configuration suggested that its internal dimensions bore no relationship to the physical space it occupied. Within the castle's normal architectural framework, expanding to accommodate whatever storage requirements its users presented while maintaining organization systems that allowed retrieval of specific items from collections that should have been impossible to navigate or search. Effectively, the room's destruction during the Fiendfire incident that claimed Ravenclaw's diadem demonstrated that even the most powerful magical spaces possess limitations and vulnerabilities, that architectural magic designed to accommodate human needs can be overwhelmed by forces that exceed its protective capabilities and adaptive responses. The loss of centuries of accumulated objects and the apparent permanent damage to the room's transformative abilities served as reminder that magical architecture, however sophisticated and responsive, remains subject to destruction through application of sufficient magical force or exposure to phenomena that transcend its operational parameters. The Chamber of Secrets represents an entirely different approach to hidden magical spaces, designed not to respond to immediate needs, but to preserve specific purposes across centuries of concealment, while waiting for circumstances that would justify or require its activation. Salazar Slytherin's creation demonstrates architectural magic focused on permanence and selectivity, rather than adaptability and accessibility, creating space that could remain hidden and protected indefinitely, while maintaining the capability to serve its intended function when accessed by individuals with appropriate knowledge and authorization. The Chamber's connection to Parseltongue as access mechanism reveals sophisticated integration between architectural magic and linguistic requirements that suggests Slytherin understood principles of magical security that extended far beyond simple concealment or physical barriers. The requirement for snake language to open the chamber created access control system that could not be bypassed through conventional magical techniques or physical force, ensuring that only individuals with specific magical abilities could discover and enter the hidden space, regardless of their knowledge, authority, or determination to gain access. The basilisk's residence within the chamber demonstrates how hidden magical spaces can be designed to serve as habitats for creatures whose needs exceed what normal castle environments could provide, creating ecosystems that support magical beings whose size, dietary requirements, or environmental preferences make them unsuitable for coexistence with normal castle inhabitants. The chamber's ability to sustain a creature of the basilisk's magnitude for decades without apparent maintenance or external support suggests architectural magic that encompasses life support systems, waste management, and environmental control capabilities that rival or exceed anything achieved through conventional magical engineering. But the chamber's primary purpose, as weapon of ethnic cleansing, reveals the darker possibilities inherent in architectural magic when employed by individuals whose motivations reflect prejudice, hatred, and willingness to use their knowledge and abilities for purposes that serve ideology rather than education or protection. Slytherin's design created a system that could be activated to eliminate students whose blood status he considered unacceptable, transforming the castle itself into an instrument of genocide that could operate with efficiency and thoroughness that individual action could never achieve. The existence of additional hidden spaces throughout Hogwarts Castle seems virtually certain given the building's age, the number of powerful wizards who have inhabited it over the centuries, and the magical nature of its construction that would facilitate creation of concealed chambers, secret passages, and alternative spaces designed to serve purposes that their creators preferred to keep private. The Marauder's map revealed numerous secret passages that connected different areas of the castle and provided routes to Hogsmeade that bypassed normal security measures. But such passages likely represent only a small fraction of the hidden features that remain undiscovered or inaccessible to contemporary castle inhabitants. The founders themselves, each possessing magical abilities and knowledge that exceeded anything available to subsequent generations, would have had both motivation and capability to create hidden spaces that reflected their individual priorities, magical specialties, and long-term vision for how the castle should serve its educational mission across centuries of changing circumstances and evolving threats. Godric Gryffindor's contributions to castle architecture might include training facilities designed to develop courage and combat skills, while Helga Hufflepuff might have created hidden gardens or food preservation systems that could sustain the castle's inhabitants during sieges or other emergency situations. Rowena Ravenclaw's architectural contributions would likely reflect her intellectual interests and her understanding of how physical environments can support or hinder learning and research activities, potentially creating libraries, laboratories, or study spaces that provide access to knowledge and resources unavailable through conventional educational channels. The Diadem's presence at Hogwarts suggests that Ravenclaw maintained connections to the castle throughout her life and might have established hidden repositories for her most valuable intellectual achievements and magical innovations. The moving staircases that serve as one of Hogwarts' most distinctive architectural features demonstrate integration between structural elements and consciousness that allows the castle to actively participate in determining how its inhabitants move through its spaces and interact with its various chambers and facilities. The staircase's tendency to change position according to schedules and preferences that remain mysterious to castle inhabitants suggests that the building possesses its own agenda and priorities that may not always align with the immediate convenience or desires of students and staff members, who must navigate its constantly shifting internal geography. The vanishing steps that occasionally appear within otherwise normal staircases create hazards that serve no apparent practical purpose while testing the reflexes and alertness of castle inhabitants, who must remain constantly aware that familiar routes might suddenly present unexpected obstacles or dangers. Such features suggest that the castle's consciousness includes elements of mischief or testing that challenge, assumptions about the proper relationship between buildings and their inhabitants, transforming simple navigation into ongoing assessment of adaptability and awareness. The trick doors that occasionally refuse to open unless approached in specific ways or at particular times demonstrate architectural consciousness that extends to detailed regulation of access and movement throughout the castle's interior spaces. These doors appear to possess individual personalities and preferences that affect their willingness to cooperate with requests for passage, creating relationship dynamics between castle features and inhabitants that resemble social interactions more than simple mechanical operations. Filch's admission that he continues to discover corridors and chambers that he had never encountered during his decades of service at Hogwarts reveals the scope of architectural complexity that exceeds what any single individual could fully explore or document during even extended residence at the castle. The continued discovery of new spaces after years of systematic exploration suggests that the castle's internal geography may be more dynamic and extensive than its external dimensions would suggest, possibly including areas that exist only intermittently or that require specific conditions for access and exploration. The possibility that some hidden spaces might be created spontaneously by the castle's consciousness in response to immediate needs or circumstances would explain the ongoing discovery of previously unknown areas, while also suggesting that architectural magic at Hogwarts operates according to principles of continuous creation rather than simple preservation of features established during original construction. Such dynamic architecture would represent collaboration between human needs and magical consciousness that transcends normal understanding of how buildings relate to their purposes and inhabitants. The maintenance systems that keep Hogwarts functioning despite its age and complexity remain largely invisible and unexplained, operating through mechanisms that preserve structural integrity, provide essential services, and maintain magical functionality without apparent intervention from human staff or conventional maintenance procedures. The castle's ability to repair damage, regulate temperature, provide illumination, and manage waste disposal for hundreds of inhabitants suggests infrastructure that operates according to magical principles rather than mechanical or technological systems that would require constant oversight and periodic replacement. The house elf involvement in castle maintenance represents one of the few visible aspects of the support systems that keep Hogwarts operational, but the scope and complexity of magical maintenance required for such an institution suggests that house elf labor, extensive though it may be, constitutes only portion of the total effort required to maintain architectural magic on the scale that Hogwarts represents. The deeper maintenance systems that sustain the castle's magical consciousness preserve its architectural spells across centuries of use and enable its continuous adaptation to changing needs, likely operate through mechanisms that transcend both house elf capabilities and conventional magical techniques. The Marauder's map's comprehensive awareness of castle geography and inhabitant locations demonstrates surveillance capabilities that exceed anything that normal magical monitoring could achieve, suggesting integration between architectural consciousness and detection magic that creates omniscient awareness of everything occurring within the castle's boundaries. The map's ability to track individuals through hidden passages, secret chambers, and concealed spaces indicates that its surveillance extends to areas that normal castle inhabitants might consider private or secure from external observation. The creation of such comprehensive monitoring systems raises questions about privacy, security, and the proper relationship between institutional oversight and individual autonomy that become particularly complex when the institution itself possesses consciousness and agenda that may not always align with the interests or preferences of its inhabitants. The possibility that the castle maintains complete awareness of every action, conversation, and movement within its boundaries transforms residents at Hogwarts into form of existence under constant surveillance that inhabitants accept implicitly by choosing to remain within the building's magical influence. The long-term evolution of Hogwarts' architectural consciousness and its relationship with successive generations of inhabitants remains largely unexplored, despite obvious relevance to understanding how the castle adapts to relevance to understanding how the castle, changing educational needs, security threats, and cultural expectations over centuries of continuous operation. The building's responses to different headmasters, its adaptation to various educational philosophies and administrative approaches, and its integration of new magical technologies and defensive systems suggest ongoing development rather than static preservation of original design intentions. The ultimate question of whether Hogwarts represents unique achievement in architectural magic or example of building techniques that were once more common but have been lost to subsequent generations affects understanding of magical education, institutional design, and the relationship between consciousness and constructed environments throughout magical society. If similar architectural consciousness could be achieved in other buildings, the implications for magical urban planning, institutional design, and residential construction would revolutionize approaches to creating environments that actively support their inhabitants' needs and purposes, rather than simply providing passive shelter and workspace. In the realm where stone and timber achieve awareness, where architectural spaces respond to human need with intelligence that transcends mechanical response, where hidden chambers wait patiently for discovery by individuals whose purposes align with their creators' long-dormant intentions, the true meaning of magical architecture reveals itself as collaboration between human consciousness and cosmic forces that transforms simple construction into living partnership between builder and built, inhabitant and habitat, need and fulfillment that operates according to principles that exist at the intersection between individual desire and universal patterns of meaning that connect every conscious being to the eternal rhythms of creation and discovery. In the mysterious realm where consciousness transcends the boundaries between species, where emotional connections forge bonds that surpass the normal limitations of communication and understanding, there exist relationships so profound and enigmatic that they challenge every assumption about the nature of loyalty, companionship, and the deeper spiritual forces that unite different forms of magical life in partnerships that neither science nor conventional wisdom can adequately explain or predict. The bonds that form between wizards and magical creatures operate according to principles that extend far beyond simple training, domestication, or mutual advantage, creating connections that touch the very essence of identity and purpose, while revealing depths of interspecies communion that suggest consciousness itself may be far more universal and accessible than rational analysis typically acknowledges. Fawkes the Phoenix and Albus Dumbledore shared a relationship that transcended every conventional category of human-creature interaction, demonstrating partnerships so profound and mysterious that its origins remained unknown even to those who witnessed its manifestations across decades of collaboration and mutual support. The bond between Headmaster and Phoenix operated on levels that exceeded normal magical theory's capacity to explain or classify, creating unity of purpose and communication that suggested either extraordinary magical achievement or access to forms of interspecies communion that exist naturally but remain largely unexplored by magical scholarship and contemporary understanding. The depth of connection between Dumbledore and Fawkes became apparent during moments of greatest crisis, when the Phoenix's intervention transcended normal creature behavior to encompass deliberate action that demonstrated not merely loyalty, but sophisticated understanding of complex situations and strategic thinking that indicated genuine partnership rather than simple obedience or trained response to external commands. Fawkes' arrival in the Chamber of Secrets with the Sorting Hat and Sword of Gryffindor represented coordinated action that required understanding of Harry Potter's needs, knowledge of available resources, and decision-making capability that exceeded anything normally attributed to creature intelligence, regardless of magical enhancement or special training. The Phoenix's healing tears, applied to Harry's basilisk venom wound with precision that saved his life, while demonstrating perfect understanding of the medical emergency and appropriate treatment, revealed abilities that extended beyond instinctive behavior to encompass diagnostic capability and therapeutic knowledge that suggested either extraordinary intelligence or access to magical understanding that transcended normal learning processes. The timing and application of Phoenix tears indicated not fortunate coincidence but deliberate healing intervention based on accurate assessment of injury, severity, and treatment requirements that would challenge experienced medical practitioners. But perhaps most remarkably, Fawkes's actions suggested loyalty that extended beyond Dumbledore himself to encompass individuals whom Dumbledore valued and sought to protect, creating network of concern and protective intervention that operated through emotional and spiritual connections, rather than explicit commands or training protocols. The Phoenix's immediate response to Harry's loyalty to Dumbledore, summoning assistance before such help had been requested or even anticipated, demonstrated awareness of relationship dynamics and emotional states that indicated empathic abilities of extraordinary sophistication and sensitivity. The mystery of how the bond between Dumbledore and Fawkes originally formed remains one of the most intriguing unsolved questions in magical creature relationships, touching on fundamental issues about the nature of choice, recognition, and spiritual affinity that determine why certain combinations of wizard and creature achieve profound partnership while others remain limited to more conventional forms of association. The absence of any documented account of their first meeting or the circumstances that led to their partnership suggests either deliberate privacy about deeply personal spiritual experience or recognition that some forms of connection transcend narrative description and rational analysis. The theoretical frameworks that govern Phoenix-wizard relationships remain largely unexplored by magical scholarship, which has traditionally focused on practical applications and observable behaviors rather than the deeper psychological and spiritual dynamics that create lasting bonds between different forms of consciousness. The Phoenix's unique nature, as creature capable of death and rebirth through flame, of healing through tears, of carrying enormous weights despite delicate appearance, suggests magical abilities that operate according to principles fundamentally different from normal creature magic, requiring partnership approaches that transcend conventional training methods and relationship development strategies. Phoenix loyalty appears to be granted rather than earned, chosen by the Phoenix itself, according to criteria that remain mysterious to external observers and may not be fully understood even by the wizards who receive such extraordinary partnership. The selectivity demonstrated by Phoenixes in forming deep bonds suggests evaluation processes that assess character, purpose, and spiritual compatibility through methods that exceed normal magical detection and analysis, creating relationships based on recognition of essential qualities that may not be apparent through casual interaction or superficial acquaintance. Fawkes's departure from Hogwarts following Dumbledore's death demonstrated the depth of connection between Phoenix and wizard while also revealing the apparently permanent nature of such bonds, suggesting that Phoenix loyalty, once given, cannot be transferred to other individuals regardless of their worthiness, magical ability, or need for Phoenix partnership. The timing of the departure, occurring immediately after Dumbledore's death without any apparent period of consideration or evaluation of alternative arrangements, indicated that the bond had been exclusive and non-transferable, ending completely with the death of the human partner. The Phoenix's final song, heard throughout Hogwarts as a lament that honored Dumbledore's passing while serving as farewell to the castle and community that had been home for so many years, revealed emotional depth and aesthetic sensibility that challenged every assumption about creature consciousness and the capacity for abstract expression of grief, loss, and remembrance. The lament transcended simple animal distress to encompass musical composition that communicated complex emotional states and philosophical reflections on mortality, legacy, and the meaning of partnership across species boundaries. The absence of any indication regarding Fawkes's ultimate destination or future activities after leaving Hogwarts reflects the mystery that surrounds Phoenix life cycles and behavior patterns outside their relationships with human partners, suggesting that such creatures possess independent purposes and activities that remain largely unknown to magical naturalists and creature specialists. The possibility that phoenixes exist primarily to form partnerships with exceptional wizards, appearing when such connections are possible and disappearing when circumstances no longer support such relationships, would explain both their rarity and their extraordinary loyalty when bonds are successfully established. House elf enslavement represents far more complex and morally troubling example of wizard-creature bonding, involving magical compulsion that creates loyalty and obedience through supernatural means that override normal creature autonomy and free will. The magical mechanisms that bind house elves to wizarding families operate through principles that remain largely unexplored, despite their obvious importance to understanding both the ethics of such relationships and the magical theories that make such comprehensive mental and emotional control possible across extended periods and multiple generations of both elves and human families. The apparent contentment displayed by many house elves under conditions that would constitute torture for other creatures suggests either successful psychological conditioning that eliminates desire for freedom and independence, or fundamental differences in elf consciousness and emotional needs that make servitude genuinely fulfilling rather than merely tolerated. The question of whether house elf satisfaction represents authentic contentment or magically induced compliance affects every moral and legal consideration surrounding their treatment and the obligations that wizarding society bears toward creatures whose freedom has been systematically eliminated through supernatural means. Creatures' evolution from hostile, bitter servant to loyal ally demonstrates the potential for positive relationships within the house elf bonding system when wizards treat their elves with respect, consideration, and genuine care rather than casual disregard or active cruelty. The transformation of his attitude and behavior in response to Harry Potter's courteous treatment suggests that house elf psychology retains capacity for genuine emotional response and relationship development despite magical constraints that limit their ability to express dissatisfaction or pursue independent goals. But the magical enforcement mechanisms that prevent house elves from revealing family secrets, betraying their master's interests, or acting against wizarding family welfare indicate that even positive relationships within the house elf system operate under conditions of magical compulsion that compromise the authenticity of any loyalty or affection that positive relationships develops. The question of whether house elf love for their families represents genuine emotion or magically manufactured response remains unanswerable within current frameworks for understanding consciousness, free will, and the relationship between supernatural compulsion and authentic psychological states. Dobby's liberation and subsequent behavior as free elf provided glimpse of house elf potential when magical constraints are removed, revealing capabilities for independent thought, moral judgment, and voluntary loyalty that suggested the species possesses full consciousness and emotional complexity, despite centuries of magical subjugation that had concealed such qualities from most wizarding observers. His voluntary service to Dumbledore, and later sacrifice to protect Harry Potter, demonstrated that house elf loyalty when freely given rather than magically compelled, could achieve levels of dedication and courage that exceeded anything produced through supernatural bondage. The broader implications of house elf consciousness and capabilities for understanding magical creature rights and the ethics of wizard-creature relationships remain largely unexplored by wizarding legal and philosophical scholarship, reflecting institutional reluctance to examine systems that provide significant economic and social benefits to wizarding society regardless of their moral implications. The possibility that other forms of creature bondage and control might involve similar violations of consciousness and autonomy suggests the need for comprehensive re-evaluation of wizarding relationships with all magical species that serve human purposes through means that may compromise their natural freedom and development. Patronus magic represents an entirely different category of wizard-creature connection, involving manifestation of spiritual guardians that take animal forms reflecting deep aspects of their casters' personalities, emotional associations, and psychological structures that may not be apparent through casual observation or self-analysis. The silver creatures that emerge from successful Patronus casting demonstrate connections between human consciousness and animal archetypes that suggest either symbolic relationships that reflect psychological truths or actual spiritual bonds with creature essences that exist independently of physical manifestation. The specific animals that appear as Patronus forms seem to be determined by factors that exceed conscious choice or deliberate selection, emerging from deep psychological processes that reveal aspects of personality and spiritual identity that may be unknown even to the wizards who cast such magic. The inability to deliberately choose or change Patronus forms suggests that these manifestations reflect fundamental truths about individual nature rather than temporary emotional states or acquired preferences that could be modified through conscious effort or magical intervention. James Potter and Severus Snape's shared doe Patronus, both reflecting their connection to Lily Evans, demonstrated how profound emotional attachments could influence the spiritual creatures that represented their essential natures, creating parallel manifestations that revealed the depth of their feelings while also raising questions about the relationship between love, identity, and the magical forces that determine Patronus forms. The persistence of Snape's doe Patronus throughout his adult life, despite the evolution of his relationship with Lily's memory from romantic love to protective devotion, suggested that such forms reflect enduring rather than temporary aspects of personality and emotional structure. The possibility that Patronus forms could change in response to major life events, traumatic experiences, or fundamental shifts in personality and priorities remains theoretically possible but rarely documented, suggesting either that such transformations require extraordinary circumstances or that the spiritual connections represented by Patronus magic operate according to principles of permanence that resist modification through normal, psychological development or life experience. Animagus transformations represent the most complete form of wizard-animal connection achievable through magical means, involving fundamental alteration of physical form and consciousness that creates temporary but complete unity between human and animal nature. The specific animals that wizards can become as animagi appear to be determined by factors similar to those that govern Patronus manifestation, reflecting deep psychological truths and spiritual affinities that cannot be consciously controlled or deliberately selected through training or magical technique. The lengthy and dangerous process required to achieve animagus transformation, involving complex magical procedures that carry significant risks of permanent damage or death if performed incorrectly, suggests that such complete species transformation requires not merely technical skill, but fundamental compatibility between human consciousness and animal nature that exists only rarely and cannot be artificially created through magical enhancement or intensive training programs. The legal registration requirements for animagi reflect ministry recognition that such transformation abilities create security and identification challenges that could be exploited for criminal purposes, allowing individuals to assume animal forms that would make them difficult to track, identify, or apprehend through normal law enforcement methods. But the small number of registered animagi compared to the theoretical number of wizards who might possess the necessary technical skills suggests either that the natural compatibility required for such transformation is extremely rare, or that the difficulty and danger of the process deter most potential practitioners from attempting such radical, magical achievement. The Marauders' successful achievement of animagus transformation during their student years at Hogwarts demonstrates that such radical magical accomplishment does not require advanced education or professional training, depending instead on natural aptitude, determination, and compatibility between individual consciousness and animal nature that transcends formal magical learning. Their ability to maintain their transformations safely and use them effectively for practical purposes suggests that successful animagus development creates stable and reliable access to alternative forms of consciousness and physical capability. But the psychological effects of regular transformation between human and animal consciousness remain largely unexplored, despite obvious relevance to understanding how such radical alterations affect personality, memory, and the continuity of individual identity across different forms of physical existence. The question of whether animagi retain full human consciousness while in animal form, or experience temporary shifts toward animal psychology and instinct affects understanding of what such transformation actually accomplishes, and whether it represents expansion of human capability or temporary surrender of human nature. The bonds between wizards and magical creatures that transcend normal categories of relationship and partnership reveal the profound interconnectedness of consciousness throughout the magical world, demonstrating that awareness, loyalty, and spiritual connection operate according to principles that exceed species boundaries, while creating possibilities for communion and cooperation that enrich both human and creature existence. In the realm where Phoenix Song carries messages of love beyond death, where house elf magic serves purposes greater than servitude, where silver guardians manifest the deepest truths of human nature in animal form, the mystery of interspecies connection remains forever beyond complete understanding, inviting exploration while revealing depths of spiritual reality that connect every conscious being to universal patterns of recognition, loyalty, and love that transcend every limitation imposed by physical form or species origin. In the deepest recesses of the Ministry of Magic, behind doors that bear no nameplates and down corridors that exist on no official architectural plans, there operates a department so shrouded in secrecy that even its existence remains officially unacknowledged by most governmental publications and administrative documents. The Department of Mystery stands as monument to institutional recognition that certain aspects of magical reality transcend normal bureaucratic oversight and democratic accountability, requiring specialized research conducted by individuals whose dedication to understanding fundamental forces exceeds their concern for personal recognition, social interaction, or conventional career advancement within the broader magical community that surrounds but never truly comprehends their work. The unspeakables who staff this most enigmatic of magical institutions represent carefully selected individuals whose psychological profiles, magical abilities, and intellectual capabilities mark them as uniquely suited for confronting mysteries that have puzzled wizardkind for centuries without yielding meaningful progress toward resolution or understanding. The recruitment process that identifies and evaluates potential unspeakables remains as mysterious as their subsequent research activities, involving selection criteria that appear to prioritize mental stability under extreme conceptual stress, ability to maintain absolute confidentiality indefinitely, and willingness to dedicate entire careers to investigating phenomena that may never yield satisfactory explanations or practical applications. The anonymity that defines unspeakable existence extends beyond simple professional discretion to encompass complete surrender of individual identity in service of collective research goals that transcend personal ambition or desire for recognition. These researchers abandon normal social connections, family relationships, and community involvement to immerse themselves completely in studies that require total commitment and isolation from influences that might compromise their objectivity or dedication to understanding forces that operate according to principles alien to normal human experience and expectation. The department's physical structure reflects its unique mission through architectural design that prioritizes containment, observation, and analysis of phenomena too dangerous or unpredictable for normal laboratory conditions or conventional research methodologies. Each chamber within the department serves specific investigative purpose, while also functioning as potential containment system should the forces under study prove more powerful or less controllable than theoretical analysis suggests, creating research environment where discovery and danger exist in constant tension that demands absolute precision and unwavering caution from everyone involved. The Hall of Prophecy stretches through dimensions that seem to exceed the physical space available within the ministry building, housing thousands of crystalline spheres that preserve glimpses of possible futures spoken by individuals whose consciousness briefly touched the currents of temporal flow that carry information backward through time from events that may or may not occur depending on choices yet to be made by people who remain unaware of their crucial roles in determining cosmic outcomes. The organization system that allows navigation through such vast collections of prophetic material remains unknown to external observers, suggesting either magical cataloging methods that transcend normal information management or institutional knowledge that has been preserved across generations of unspeakable service. Despite the secrecy that prevents normal academic continuity and knowledge transfer, the prophecies themselves exist as more than simple predictions or warnings about future events, containing concentrated spiritual energy that can only be safely accessed by individuals whose lives will be directly affected by the predictions they contain. This restriction creates paradox, where the people most capable of understanding and responding to prophetic warnings are often the least prepared psychologically or strategically to process information that reveals their own destiny while simultaneously creating obligation to fulfill or prevent the very futures that the prophecies describe. The vast majority of prophecies remain unfulfilled and largely irrelevant to historical development, suggesting that the ability to perceive possible futures does not guarantee that such futures will manifest in reality, but rather reveals the complex web of potential outcomes that exist in quantum superposition until specific choices and events collapse probability waves into definite historical sequences. The persistence of unused prophecies raises questions about the relationship between prediction and causality, between knowledge of future possibilities and the responsibility that such knowledge creates for those who possess it. The time room contains apparatus and instruments designed to study temporal mechanics through methods that extend far beyond the simple time travel capabilities provided by time-turner technology, encompassing research into the fundamental nature of causality, the relationship between consciousness and temporal experience, and the possibility of achieving forms of temporal manipulation that transcend normal limitations imposed by linear chronology and sequential cause and effect relationships. The destruction of Time Turner stocks during the Battle of the Department of Mysteries eliminated only the most basic and practical applications of temporal magic, while leaving intact the theoretical research and experimental equipment needed for more sophisticated investigations into time's deeper mysteries. The bell jar that cycles a bird through stages of life and death demonstrates time magic focused on biological processes rather than transportation of consciousness through temporal displacement, revealing research into aging, mortality, and the possibility of achieving biological immortality through manipulation of the temporal fields that govern cellular development and decay. The bird's continuous transformation from egg to maturity to death and back to egg suggests mastery of time magic that could theoretically be applied to human subjects, creating possibilities for indefinite life extension or reversal of age-related damage that exceeds anything achievable through conventional magical healing or life-prolonging potions. But the ethical implications of such research, conducted on creatures whose consent could never be obtained and whose suffering might continue indefinitely within experimental cycles designed to test temporal manipulation techniques, reveal the moral compromises that department research often requires from individuals whose dedication to understanding transcends normal concerns about the welfare of subjects, whose sacrifice serves supposedly greater purposes of advancing knowledge and protecting magical society from threats that conventional approaches cannot address. The brain room houses thinking organs preserved in fluid that maintains their intellectual activity while severing their connections to the bodies and nervous systems that originally supported their consciousness, creating laboratory conditions for studying pure thought processes without the complications introduced by physical sensations, emotional responses, or biological needs that normally influence cognitive function. The floating brains with ribbon-like tendrils that can attack intruders suggest either defensive mechanisms built into the experimental setup or evolution of disembodied consciousness toward forms of existence that transcend normal categories of life and death while developing capabilities that their original owners never possessed or imagined. The research applications that justify maintaining collections of thinking brains remain classified at levels that exceed normal ministry security protocols, suggesting investigations into consciousness transfer, artificial intelligence creation, or mind manipulation techniques that could fundamentally alter understanding of individual identity and the relationship between thought and physical substrate. The possibility that such research aims toward creating artificial consciousness or preserving human intelligence beyond biological death opens questions about identity, mortality, and the ethics of consciousness manipulation that challenge every assumption about the proper boundaries of magical research and institutional authority. The attacks on intruders by brain tendrils demonstrate that consciousness, even when severed from its original physical housing, retains capacity for recognizing threats and responding with coordinated defensive action that suggests either preservation of memory and personality or development of new forms of awareness adapted to their artificial environment. The ribbon-like extensions that connect the floating brains might serve as communication networks that allow coordination between separate consciousness units, creating collective intelligence systems that exceed the capabilities of individual brains, while raising questions about the persistence of individual identity within such collaborative cognitive structures. The planet room contains models of celestial bodies and astronomical phenomena that apparently respond to actual cosmic events through sympathetic magic that links the miniature representations to the distant objects they represent, creating laboratory conditions for studying astronomical magic and the relationships between cosmic forces and earthbound magical phenomena. The floating planets and stars within the chamber suggest research into gravitational magic, spatial manipulation, and the possibility of achieving magical effects that operate across interstellar distances through principles that transcend normal magical theories' understanding of range limitations and energy requirements. The astronomical research conducted within the planet room might focus on astrology as legitimate magical science rather than simple divination technique, investigating how celestial configurations actually influence magical ability, spell effectiveness, and the timing of major magical events through mechanisms that operate according to cosmic principles rather than psychological suggestion or cultural tradition. The ability to observe cosmic events through magical models might provide advance warning of astronomical phenomena that could affect magical society, or enable prediction of optimal timing for major magical undertakings that require celestial support for maximum effectiveness. But the room's research applications might extend beyond simple astronomical observation to encompass attempts at magical space travel, communication with extraterrestrial magical civilizations, or manipulation of cosmic forces for purposes that transcend earthbound magical applications. The department's investigation of space magic might represent humanity's first serious attempts to expand magical influence beyond planetary boundaries, while exploring questions about whether magical laws operate consistently throughout the universe or vary according to local conditions that affect spellcasting, creature behavior, and the fundamental nature of magical force itself. The Love Room represents perhaps the most mysterious and potentially dangerous area of department research, devoted to studying emotional forces that operate according to principles so powerful and alien to normal magical theory that the chamber must remain permanently sealed to prevent accidental release of energies that could overwhelm anyone exposed to them without proper preparation and protection. Dumbledore's description of love as more wonderful and terrible than death suggests that emotional magic operates on scales and through mechanisms that exceed every other form of magical force in both creative and destructive potential. The research conducted within the sealed Love Room remains completely unknown to external observers, but theoretical speculation suggests investigations into the magical mechanisms that govern emotional bonding, the relationship between love and other forms of supernatural protection, and the possibility of weaponizing or artificially creating the kinds of emotional states that produce magic powerful enough to overcome death itself. Such research would require experimental methodologies that challenge every ethical principle governing magical research, while potentially yielding understanding of forces that could revolutionize every aspect of magical society and human relationship. The permanent sealing of the Love Room indicates that previous research attempts produced results too dangerous for continued investigation or revealed truths about love's nature that department leadership decided were too powerful for safe study under any circumstances. The possibility that love magic, when properly understood and applied, could exceed even the unforgivable curses in both beneficial and destructive applications suggests that emotional research might represent the ultimate frontier of magical investigation, offering possibilities for unprecedented achievement, while threatening consequences that could affect entire civilizations. The institutional culture within the Department of Mysteries operates according to principles of absolute secrecy and lifetime commitment that transform individual unspeakables into extensions of collective research goals, rather than independent scholars pursuing personal interests or career advancement. The surrender of normal human relationships and social connections required for department service reflects recognition that such research demands complete dedication that cannot coexist with external obligations or divided loyalties that might compromise research, security, or individual commitment to understanding forces that transcend personal concerns. The psychological support systems that maintain unspeakable mental health under conditions of extreme isolation and exposure to phenomena that challenge fundamental assumptions about reality remain unknown, but presumably involve specialized training, peer support networks, and possibly magical interventions designed to preserve sanity while enabling continued exposure to concepts and experiences that could prove overwhelming to minds not specifically prepared for such extreme intellectual and emotional challenges. The career advancement opportunities within the department presumably focus on research, responsibility, and investigative specialization rather than administrative hierarchy or public recognition, creating professional development paths that reward expertise and dedication while maintaining anonymity that prevents external evaluation or competition between individual researchers. The possibility that senior unspeakables achieve forms of magical understanding that transcend normal human limitations suggests that department service might represent pathway toward enhanced consciousness or supernatural capability that compensates for the social and personal sacrifices required by such dedication. The ultimate purpose that justifies the department's existence and the enormous resources devoted to investigating phenomena that may never yield practical applications remains officially classified, but presumably relates to protecting magical society from threats that conventional magical defenses cannot address effectively. The department's research into fundamental forces like time, space, death, thought, and love suggests preparation for confronting challenges that transcend normal categories of magical conflict or natural disaster, requiring understanding of cosmic principles that could prove essential for human survival, under circumstances that normal magical education and training cannot anticipate or prepare for adequately. The coordination between department research and other aspects of ministry function remains largely invisible to external observers, but presumably involves information sharing that influences policy decisions, security measures, and emergency preparedness, without revealing specific research findings or methodologies that must remain classified for public safety or national security reasons. The possibility that department discoveries have already influenced major historical events or prevented catastrophes that would have threatened magical civilization entirely suggests that unspeakable dedication serves purposes far greater than academic curiosity or theoretical advancement. Rest now, young wizard, as our journey through the great unknowns draws to its peaceful close. In the gentle darkness of this magical hour, let yourself find comfort in the truth that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, that wonder itself is more precious than any answer we might discover. The veil will continue to flutter in its ancient chamber. The echoes of twin wands will forever whisper their secrets. And somewhere, in the depths of the Department of Mysteries, forces beyond our understanding continue their eternal dance. These unsolved puzzles are not failures of knowledge, but gifts of imagination, invitations to dream and wonder, and explore the infinite possibilities that magic offers to those wise enough to embrace the unknown. As you drift toward dreams, remember that the greatest magic isn't in having all the answers, but in being brave enough to keep asking the questions. Sleep well, knowing that mystery itself is a form of magic, and in your dreams, may you find peace in the beautiful uncertainty of a world where anything is possible and everything remains wonderfully eternally unexplained.